I've been hauling freight across the northern routes for close to 12 years now, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that the roads up here don't follow the same rules as the ones down south. There's something about the way darkness settles over these highways, something that makes a man question whether he's still driving through the same world he woke up in that morning. My name's Cole Briggs, and what happened to me on the White Horse Run in February of last year still keeps me up at night, staring at my ceiling, wondering if I ever really made it back at all. On paper, the load was quite easy. I was going to transport industrial equipment from Dawson Creek to Whitehorse, a route I had probably traveled many times before. The dispatcher, a man named Rick who worked the night shift while I was driving, gave me the usual information. A 16-hour drive, weather conditions at minus 38 degrees, highway conditions moderate. There was nothing I hadn't handled before. I had finished loading the previous afternoon, double-checked my chains, made sure my diesel fuel wouldn't freeze in the cold, and hit the road around 3 in the afternoon, just as the sun began to set early in the winter. The first few hours were uneventful in that particular way. Northern drives always are. The highway stretched out ahead of me like a gray ribbon laid across an endless white tablecloth. Trees pressing in from both sides, their branches heavy with snow that hadn't melted since November. Every 20 miles or so I'd pass another rig heading south, and we'd exchange that brief flash of high beams that serves as the only real communication up here. The radio kept me company for a while, some talk show out of Prince George discussing hockey scores and weather patterns, but the signal started breaking up around mile marker 287, dissolving into static that sounded almost like whispering if you listened to it long enough. I'd been driving for about 6 hours when I noticed the first oddity, though at the time I didn't think much of it. There was a green highway sign ahead, the kind that tells you what's coming up at the next junction. I was familiar enough with this stretch of road to know there weren't any major turnoffs for another 40 miles. But as my headlights swept across it, I could clearly read Crossroads, 2 miles, printed in white reflective letters. I frowned at that, trying to remember if they'd added a new service road or logging route since my last trip through. The northern highways change sometimes, new resource roads appearing overnight as companies push deeper into the wilderness. So it wasn't impossible. 2 miles later, I was watching for the turnoff, but there was nothing. The highway continued its straight path through the darkness. The same unbroken line of trees on both sides, no indication that any road had ever branched off from this spot. I checked my GPS, an old Garmin unit I'd been using for years because it still had detailed logging road maps most newer systems didn't bother with. According to the screen, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, following Highway 97 north with no junctions, intersections, or crossroads marked anywhere in the vicinity. The temperature had dropped even further by the time I hit hour 8, my dashboard thermometer reading minus 42. At those temperatures, everything changes. The air itself seems to crystallize, and your breath comes out in clouds so thick they could almost be solid. I'd been through worse, but there was something about this particular cold that felt different, felt deliberate somehow. The kind of cold that doesn't just freeze your skin but seems to seep into your bones and settle there, making a home in your marrow. I was thinking about pulling over at the next rest area when I saw the sign again. Same green reflective surface, same white lettering. Crossroads, 2 miles. This time I was certain something was wrong. I'd been watching the road carefully, and I knew for a fact I hadn't passed any crossroads the first time. More than that, I'd been keeping track of the mile markers, and I was at least 40 miles past where I'd seen that first sign. There was no way the same sign could appear twice on a straight highway unless someone had put up duplicates, which made no sense at all. I grabbed my CB radio and keyed the mic, my voice sounding harsh in the quiet of the cab. "This is northbound 87 to any driver in the area. You got your ears on?" Static answered me, that same whispering quality I'd heard in the regular radio earlier. I tried again, cycling through the channels, but got nothing except that strange interference. In 12 years of driving these routes, I'd never had trouble reaching someone on the CB. There are always truckers out here, always someone hauling something through the darkness, and the CB is our lifeline, our way of staying connected to the human world when everything else falls away. The 2 miles passed slowly, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, watching for any sign of an intersection or turnoff. My high beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the falling snow that had started up about an hour back. Nothing but highway, nothing but trees, nothing but that endless white and gray and black. When my odometer told me I'd gone 2 miles past the sign, I started counting telephone poles, watching for anything that might indicate a road, even an old abandoned logging trail. There was nothing. That's when my engine started making a sound it had never made before. A low, rhythmic knocking that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the block. A sound that felt less like mechanical failure and more like something trying to communicate. I've been around diesel engines my whole adult life. Rebuilt 3 of them from scratch, and I'd never heard anything quite like it. The rhythm was too regular, too measured, almost like Morse code or a heartbeat. I eased off the throttle, but the sound continued at the same tempo regardless of my engine speed. I pulled over onto the shoulder, letting the engine idle while I tried to diagnose the problem. The sound continued, steady and insistent, and now that I was stopped, I could hear something else underneath it. A low humming, almost subsonic, that seemed to vibrate through the frame of the truck. I killed the engine and the knocking stopped immediately, but the humming continued. That's when I realized it wasn't coming from my truck at all. It was coming from outside, from somewhere in the trees. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to get back in the cab, start the engine, and keep driving. But there's something that happens to you when you spend enough time alone on these northern routes. You start to question your own judgment, start to wonder if the isolation is making you imagine things. I needed to know if that sound was real, if there was actually something out there in the darkness, or if I was finally succumbing to the particular kind of madness that claims truckers who spend too many nights staring at empty highways. I grabbed my flashlight from the cab, a heavy mag light that could double as a weapon if needed, and stepped out into the cold. The temperature hit me like a physical blow, the kind of cold that makes your lungs ache and your eyes water. I could feel my beard starting to frost up immediately, ice crystals forming in the moisture of my breath. The humming was clearer now, a deep bass tone that I could feel in my chest more than hear with my ears. It seemed to be coming from the tree line about 30 yards off the highway. I walked toward the sound, my boots crunching in the snow that had drifted across the shoulder. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating twisted branches and shadows that seemed to move just outside the circle of light. The humming grew louder as I approached the trees, and I could start to make out what looked like a structure of some kind hidden in the shadows. Not a building exactly, but something man-made, something that didn't belong in this wilderness. As I got closer, I could see it was some kind of junction box or generator housing, a metal structure about the size of a small shed, partially buried in snow. The humming was definitely coming from inside it, that deep vibration that I could feel through the soles of my boots. There were no markings on it, no utility company logos or warning signs, just rusted metal and darkness. I reached out to touch it, and the moment my gloved hand made contact, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind in the trees, no distant highway sounds, nothing but my own breathing and the faint creak of leather as I shifted my weight. I stood there for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, my hand still pressed against the cold metal, waiting for something to happen. When nothing did, I pulled back and returned to my truck, walking faster than I'd like to admit, looking over my shoulder every few steps. I climbed back into the cab and sat there with the door locked, watching the junction box through my windshield. My engine started on the first try, that strange knocking completely gone, and I pulled back onto the highway without looking back. But as my truck began to move, I saw something in my side mirror that made my blood freeze. There was a figure standing next to the junction box, a dark silhouette against the snow, completely motionless. It might have been a tree, might have been a trick of the shadows, but I don't think it was. The next 40 miles passed in a blur of snow and darkness and growing unease. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see headlights behind me or that figure somehow keeping pace with my truck, but there was nothing. The CB continued to produce only static, and my cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual this far north but felt particularly isolating tonight. I was completely alone out here, and the realization settled over me like a weight. I saw the sign for the third time just after 2 a.m. Crossroads, 2 miles. Same green sign, same white letters, but this time there was something different about it. As my headlights swept across the reflective surface, I could have sworn the number changed. Not dramatically, not in any way I could point to and say definitively that I'd seen something impossible, but a subtle shift, a momentary flicker where the 2 looked like it might have been a 0 or an 8 or some symbol I didn't recognize. I was tired by then, exhausted in a way that went beyond just physical fatigue. The kind of tired where your thoughts start to blur and reality takes on a dreamlike quality. I'd been driving for over 10 hours at that point, and the isolation was getting to me in ways I didn't want to admit. But I was certain I'd seen that sign change. Certain, with the same bone-deep conviction that told me something was fundamentally wrong about this entire night. This time, when I reached the 2-mile mark, something was different. There was a road, not a highway junction or a paved turnoff, but a narrow gravel path that cut off to the right, disappearing into the trees. There was no sign marking it, no indication of where it led or what it was for, but it was undeniably there. A break in the endless tree line that I was certain hadn't existed on my previous passes. I slowed the truck, the rational part of my brain telling me to keep driving, to ignore this impossible road and focus on reaching Whitehorse. But curiosity has always been my weakness, that need to understand, to solve puzzles, to make sense of things that don't add up. I told myself I'd just drive down the road a short distance, see if there was any indication of what it was for, then turn around and continue my route. It was a lie I told myself with full knowledge that it was a lie, but I told it anyway. The gravel road was barely wide enough for my truck, branches scraping against both sides as I crept forward. My headlights revealed a path that looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades. Deep ruts and scattered rocks that forced me to crawl along at maybe 5 miles per hour. I drove for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, the trees pressing in closer with each passing moment. Then the road opened up into a clearing, and I saw it. There, in the middle of absolute nowhere, illuminated by my headlights, was a crossroads. 4 roads met in a perfect intersection, each one stretching off into the darkness in a different direction. And at the center of the intersection, where the roads crossed, there was something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. A post, maybe 8 feet tall, with no signs or markers, just old, weathered wood that looked like it had been standing there for longer than these roads had existed. I brought my truck to a stop, engine idling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. 4 roads in the middle of the wilderness, meeting at a point that appeared on no map, marked by nothing except a single post. The logical explanations ran through my mind. Old logging roads, maybe, or surveyor trails from decades past. But none of that explained how I'd found this place, How that sign had appeared 3 times on a highway with no junctions. How this road had materialized out of nothing. That's when I noticed the tracks. Fresh tire tracks in the snow, crisp and clear, leading from the road I'd come in on and continuing straight across the intersection to the opposite road. Another truck had been here recently, within the last few hours, based on how clean the tracks were. I felt a momentary surge of relief at the thought that I wasn't the only person to have found this place, that maybe this was some kind of shortcut the local drivers use that just wasn't marked on official maps. I keyed my CB again. This is northbound 87 to any driver in the area. I'm at some kind of crossroads off Highway 97. Anyone know what this is? The static that came back was different this time, more structured, almost like it was forming words if you listened hard enough. I sat there with the mic in my hand, staring at the radio, trying to convince myself I wasn't hearing what I thought I was hearing. But there it was, barely audible under the white noise. Turn around. The voice on the radio could have been anyone. Could have been another driver trying to warn me. Could have been my own imagination creating patterns in random static. But the way my skin prickled when I heard it, the way something deep in my gut twisted with primal fear, told me I needed to listen. I put the truck in reverse, but before I could back up, my headlights caught something that made me freeze. There was another truck at the crossroads. I'd been looking at this intersection for several minutes, and I was certain it hadn't been there before. But now, there was definitely a semi parked on the opposite side facing me across the intersection. Its lights were off, the cab dark, but I could make out the silhouette of someone sitting in the driver's seat. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then slowly, deliberately, the other truck's headlights turned on, high beams blazing directly into my eyes. I threw my truck into reverse and started backing up, branches scraping along both sides of my cab. Through my mirrors, I could see the other truck beginning to move forward, crossing the intersection, following me back down the narrow road. Its high beams stayed on, flooding my cab with light, making it almost impossible to see where I was going. I was backing up as fast as I dared, my heart hammering in my chest, trying to reach the highway before that other truck reached me. The road seemed longer going back, the trees pressing in even closer, branches reaching out like fingers trying to grab hold of my truck. The headlights behind me never wavered, never blinked, just maintained that steady pursuit. I couldn't see the driver, couldn't make out any details about the truck except that it was dark-colored and old. Maybe a Peterbilt from the 80s based on the shape of the headlights. When I finally reached the highway, I didn't bother checking for traffic. I just swung my truck out onto the road and punched the accelerator, my engine roaring as I pushed it harder than I had in years. I watched my mirrors, waiting for those headlights to emerge from the gravel road, but they never did. The road was empty, the tree line unbroken, as if the turnoff had never existed at all. I didn't stop driving until I reached Whitehorse 8 hours later, completing the run on nothing but adrenaline and fear. When I finally pulled into the depot and killed my engine, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The dispatcher asked me why I was late, why I hadn't radioed in my position during the night, but I couldn't find the words to explain what had happened. How do you tell someone you spent hours driving in circles, following a road that shouldn't exist to a crossroads that couldn't be real? The company gave me 3 days off after that run, which I spent in a cheap motel room in Whitehorse, trying to convince myself that exhaustion and isolation had created some kind of hallucination. I'd heard stories about truckers on the northern routes losing their grip on reality, seeing things that weren't there, driven mad by the endless darkness and solitude. Maybe I was just another casualty of the highway, another driver who'd spent too many nights alone with his thoughts. That's what I told myself anyway, as I lay in that motel bed, listening to the sound of traffic outside and clinging to it like a lifeline to normalcy. But I couldn't stop thinking about those tire tracks at the crossroads. They'd been real, physical marks in the snow that my headlights had clearly illuminated. Hallucinations don't leave tracks. Exhaustion doesn't create roads where none existed before. Something had happened out there on that highway. Something I couldn't explain with logic or reason or any of the comfortable lies I tried to tell myself. I spent most of the second day at a local diner, drinking coffee and talking to other drivers who frequented the northern routes. Most of them had stories about strange things they'd seen, lights in the sky or weird sounds on their CB radios, but nothing quite like what I'd experienced. There was one older driver, though, a man named Dale Winters, who'd been hauling freight through the north for close to 30 years. When I mentioned the crossroads, his expression changed, and he went quiet for a long moment before speaking. "How many times did you see the sign?" he asked, his voice low. I told him 3 times, and he nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something he'd suspected. "You're lucky you turned around when you did," he said. "I've heard stories about those crossroads. Nobody who's gone through that intersection has ever been heard from again. Their trucks turn up eventually, always at some rest stop or depot, perfectly intact, but the drivers are just gone." I asked him if he'd ever seen the crossroads himself, and he shook his head. "Never seen it, but I've seen the sign. Twice over the years. Both times I kept driving, didn't turn off the highway, and both times I made it to my destination without incident. It's like the road is testing you, seeing if you'll follow it. Most drivers are smart enough to ignore it, but some aren't. Curiosity kills more than cats, if you know what I mean." We talked for another hour, Dale sharing other stories about the northern routes, warning signs that drivers had learned to recognize over the years. Certain rest areas where trucks would break down for no mechanical reason. Stretches of highway where CB radios only picked up static, no matter what channel you tried. Places where the temperature would drop 30 degrees in the span of a mile, then return to normal just as quickly. The North was full of oddities, he said, full of places where the normal rules didn't quite apply. When I left the diner, I felt both better and worse. Better because I now knew I wasn't the only one who'd encountered something strange on these highways. Worse because Dale's story suggested that what I'd experienced wasn't an isolated incident, but part of some larger pattern, some fundamental strangeness that permeated the northern routes. And the fact that other drivers had vanished after going through that intersection made my own escape feel less like luck and more like a temporary reprieve. I picked up my next load on the 4th day, a straightforward haul from Whitehorse down to Fort Nelson. The route took me back along Highway 97, the same stretch of road where I'd seen that first sign, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't nervous about it. But the company needed drivers, and I needed the money, and sitting around in motel rooms wasn't going to pay my bills or answer any of the questions that kept circling through my mind. The drive started normal enough. Clear skies, decent road conditions, temperature holding steady around -30. I passed several other trucks heading north, and the CB was active with the usual chatter about weather and road conditions and where to find the best coffee. Everything was exactly as it should be, exactly as I'd driven this route dozens of times before. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me out there in the darkness, that the crossroads wasn't finished with me yet. Around hour 5, just as the sun was setting and the highway was being swallowed by darkness, my CB radio crackled to life with a voice I didn't recognize. "Northbound 87, this is southbound 43, you got your ears on?" I grabbed the mic and responded, confirming my call sign, relieved to have some human contact. The voice on the other end sounded strained, worried. "Listen, I'm about 40 miles north of your position, and I'm seeing some weird stuff on the highway. Signs that don't match my maps, roads that shouldn't be there. You seeing anything like that?" I felt my stomach drop. Another driver, experiencing the same things I had. I asked him to describe what he was seeing, and he told me about a green reflective sign advertising a crossroads 2 miles ahead, even though his GPS showed no junctions in the area. I told him to keep driving, to ignore the sign and stay on the main highway no matter what he saw. There was a long pause on the other end, filled only with static before he responded. Too late for that. I already turned off. I'm on some kind of gravel road now, heading into the trees. I think I see something up ahead. I tried to warn him, tried to tell him to turn around immediately, but my radio filled with that familiar whispering static, drowning out my voice. I kept trying to reach him, cycling through every channel, but there was nothing except that sound, that awful sound, like 1,000 voices speaking in a language I couldn't quite understand. I drove faster, pushing my truck beyond what was safe, trying to close the distance between us, though I had no idea what I could possibly do to help. 40 miles later, I saw his truck. It was pulled over on the shoulder, hazards flashing, cab empty. I pulled up behind it and grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking as I climbed down from my cab. The other truck was still running, the driver's door hanging open, interior lights on. There was a half-empty coffee cup in the cup holder, a cigarette still smoldering in the ashtray. It looked like the driver had just stepped out for a moment and would be right back, but there were no footprints in the snow around the truck. The pristine white surface was undisturbed, except where my own boots were now marking it. I called out, my voice echoing in the darkness, but got no response. I checked the sleeper berth, the cargo area, even looked under the truck, but there was no sign of the driver anywhere. Just an empty truck idling on the shoulder of Highway 97. Its owner vanished into thin air. I radioed it in to the provincial police, gave them the truck's location and the call sign I'd heard on the CB. While I waited for them to arrive, I sat in my own cab with the doors locked, watching the empty truck through my windshield. The temperature was dropping, my dashboard thermometer showing -43, but I could have sworn I saw heat shimmer rising from the other truck's exhaust, distorting the air in ways that didn't match the cold. The police arrived about 30 minutes later, 2 officers in a Royal Canadian Mounted Police cruiser. They checked the truck, took my statement, asked me to describe the driver's voice and what he'd said on the CB. I told them everything except the part about the crossroads, about the impossible signs and the roads that shouldn't exist. I didn't think they'd believe me, and I wasn't sure I wanted them to investigate too closely. Some things are better left alone. They told me I could continue my route, that they'd handle the abandoned truck and run the plates to identify the driver. As I pulled back onto the highway, I looked in my mirror and saw the 2 officers standing next to the empty truck, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I wondered if they had any idea what they were dealing with, if they understood that this was something beyond a simple abandoned vehicle. Probably not. Probably better that way. The rest of the drive to Fort Nelson passed without incident, but I couldn't stop thinking about that driver, about how his voice had sounded on the CB, strained and worried but still rational, still human, and now he was just gone, vanished into the same darkness that had tried to claim me. I wondered how many other drivers had disappeared on these northern routes, how many empty trucks had been found on the shoulder with no explanation, no trace of their operators. When I reached Fort Nelson and dropped off my load, I told the dispatcher I needed a few more days off. She didn't argue, probably saw something in my face that convinced her I needed the break. I checked into another motel, this one even cheaper than the one in Whitehorse, and spent 2 days just sitting in my room, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made, and I started to wonder if sense had anything to do with it at all. On the 3rd day, I drove to the local library and started researching the history of Highway 97. I found articles about its construction in the 40s, stories about early truckers who'd pioneered the route, accounts of accidents and weather-related closures. But I also found something else, buried in old newspaper archives from the 50s and 60s. There were multiple reports of drivers going missing on the northern stretch of the highway, their trucks found abandoned with no sign of struggle or foul play. The articles called it the Highway 97 mystery, and authorities at the time had blamed everything from wild animal attacks to Soviet agents to simple drivers walking away from their rigs. But one article, from 1963, mentioned something that made my blood run cold. A driver who'd survived claimed he'd been following strange signs that appeared on the highway, advertising a crossroads that didn't exist on any map. He'd turned onto a gravel road and driven for miles before realizing something was wrong and managing to turn around. When he reported his experience to the police, they'd dismissed it as exhaustion-induced hallucination. 3 days later, he'd disappeared on another run, his truck found idling on the shoulder with no trace of him anywhere. I made copies of every article I could find, filling a folder with accounts of disappearances and strange occurrences along Highway 97. Most of them were from decades past, but there were more recent reports too, including one from just last year about a driver who'd radioed in that he was seeing impossible things on the highway. His transmission had cut off mid-sentence, and his truck was never found. That night, I lay in my motel room with those articles spread out on the bed around me, trying to find a pattern, some explanation that would make sense of it all. But there was no pattern except the highway itself, that long ribbon of asphalt cutting through the northern wilderness, a boundary between the normal world and something else. And the crossroads seemed to be the heart of it, the place where whatever existed out there in the darkness could reach through and pull drivers into its realm. I realized I had a choice to make. I could quit trucking, find some other line of work, abandon these northern routes and try to forget everything I'd seen. Or I could continue driving, knowing that the crossroads was still out there, still waiting, still showing itself to drivers who were unlucky enough to see those signs. The smart choice was obvious, but I've never been particularly smart about these things. I'd been driving trucks for 12 years, and the northern routes were the only life I knew. More than that, I couldn't shake the feeling that walking away would be a kind of surrender, an admission that I was too afraid to face whatever existed out there in the darkness. And I'd never been good at backing down from anything, even when I probably should. So I made my decision, told myself I'd be more careful, that I wouldn't turn off the highway no matter what signs I saw or voices I heard on the CB. It was a promise I knew I might not be able to keep, but I made it anyway. I picked up another load, heading north 2 days later. Back to Whitehorse, the same route where all of this had started. The same stretch of highway where the crossroads waited for drivers foolish enough to follow its signs. The dispatcher asked me if I was sure I wanted this run, said she could assign it to someone else if I needed more time off, but I told her I was fine, that I was ready to get back on the road. Another lie, but one that felt necessary. The first few hours of the drive were tense, my eyes constantly scanning the roadside for any sign of that green reflective marker. Every mile marker I passed felt like a small victory, another bit of distance between me and the possibility of seeing those signs again. The CB chatter was normal, other drivers talking about load weights and fuel prices and complaining about the cold. Everything was exactly as it should be, and I started to relax slightly, started to think that maybe I'd be okay. Then, around hour 7, as full darkness settled over the highway and the temperature dropped to -45, I saw it. Not the sign this time, but something else. There was a rest area ahead, one of those basic pull-off spots with a couple of picnic tables and an outhouse. I'd stopped there before on previous runs, used the facilities and stretched my legs before continuing on. But something about it looked wrong tonight. though I couldn't immediately identify what. As I got closer, I realized what it was. The rest area was full of trucks. At least a dozen semis parked in neat rows, their cabs dark. No lights or signs of activity anywhere. It was the middle of the night on one of the loneliest stretches of highway in North America, and this rest area looked like a busy truck stop at rush hour. But there were no drivers visible, no movement anywhere. Just all these trucks sitting silent in the darkness. I slowed down, debating whether to stop and investigate or just keep driving. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to keep moving, to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But I couldn't shake the image of all those empty trucks. Couldn't stop wondering if their drivers had all seen the same signs I had, if they'd all followed those gravel roads to the crossroads and never made it back. I pulled into the rest area, my headlights sweeping across the parked trucks. They were all different makes and models, different companies, different provinces on their plates. Some looked new, others were older models that had probably been on the road for decades. But they all had one thing in common. They were completely empty, their cabs dark and silent. I counted 14 trucks total, arranged in 2 neat rows, and not a single one showed any sign of recent occupation. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from my cab, the cold hitting me like always, making my lungs ache and my eyes water. I approached the nearest truck, a red Freightliner with Manitoba plates, and shined my light through the driver's side window. The cab was empty, but there were personal items scattered around. A jacket draped over the passenger seat, a thermos in the cup holder, a photo taped to the dashboard showing a woman and 2 kids. It looked like the driver had just stepped away for a moment. I checked 3 more trucks, and they were all the same. Personal belongings, signs of recent occupation, but no drivers anywhere. The doors were all locked, the keys presumably still in the ignitions, though I couldn't see them from outside. It was like all these drivers had simply vanished from their cabs simultaneously, leaving their trucks and their lives behind. That's when I heard it. The humming. That same deep bass tone I'd heard at the junction box, vibrating through the ground and up through my bones. It was coming from the tree line behind the rest area, and as I turned my flashlight toward the sound, I saw something that made me take an involuntary step backward. There was a path leading into the trees, a narrow trail that definitely hadn't been there on my previous stops at this rest area. And at the mouth of the trail, barely visible in the beam of my flashlight, was another one of those green reflective signs. I didn't need to walk closer to read it. I knew what it said: Crossroads. The sign was here, waiting for me, showing me another path to that impossible intersection. And I suddenly understood what had happened to all these drivers. They'd stopped at this rest area, seen the sign, followed the path into the trees, and they'd never come back. I turned and walked quickly back to my truck, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the door handle. I climbed into the cab and locked the doors, my heart pounding in my chest. I should have left immediately, should have started my engine and gotten back on the highway, but I sat there for a moment, staring at that path through my windshield. Part of me wanted to follow it, wanted to see where it led, wanted to understand what was happening on these northern routes. But a larger, smarter part of me knew that would be suicide. As I reached for my ignition key, every truck in the rest area turned its lights on simultaneously. 14 sets of headlights blazing to life in perfect unison, flooding the rest area with light. I screamed and ducked down in my seat, my hands over my face, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The lights just stayed on, shining in every direction, and after a long moment I slowly raised my head and looked around. All the trucks still appeared empty, their cabs dark despite their headlights being on. And then, as I watched in horror, they all started their engines. 14 diesel engines roaring to life with no one in the driver's seats, the sound echoing through the night. I fumbled with my own ignition, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key, but my truck started on the first try. I threw it into gear and accelerated out of the rest area, not caring about the ice on the road or the danger of driving too fast in these conditions. In my mirrors, I could see all 14 trucks pulling out behind me, forming a convoy that followed me back onto the highway. Their headlights stayed on high beam, flooding my cab with light, making it almost impossible to see where I was going. I pushed my truck as hard as I dared, the engine screaming in protest, but the convoy maintained its distance, never closing the gap, but never falling behind either. The 14 trucks followed me for the next 47 miles. I know the exact distance because I was watching my odometer obsessively, counting every tenth of a mile, using the numbers as a way to keep myself grounded in reality. The convoy maintained perfect formation behind me, 2 rows of 7 trucks each, their headlights creating a wall of light that eliminated any shadows and made the highway ahead look flat and surreal, like I was driving through a photograph rather than actual 3-dimensional space. My CB radio had gone completely silent, not even static anymore, just dead air that somehow felt more ominous than the whispering had. I tried my cell phone, but there was no signal, which wasn't surprising this far north, but the complete absence of any bars felt deliberate somehow, like something was actively blocking my ability to communicate with the outside world. I was alone out here with 14 ghost trucks that shouldn't be moving, and there was nobody I could call for help. The weirdest part was how the other trucks moved. They weren't weaving or drifting the way you'd expect from unmanned vehicles. They maintained perfect lane discipline, taking curves smoothly, adjusting their speed to match mine exactly. It was like they were being driven by expert truckers, except there was nobody in the cabs. I could see that clearly every time I checked my mirrors, could see the empty driver's seats illuminated by dashboard lights. Around mile 32 of the pursuit, something changed. The lead truck in the left lane, the same red Freightliner I'd shined my flashlight into back at the rest area, started to pull forward. It accelerated slowly, deliberately, coming up alongside me until we were running parallel. I looked over at it, and my blood went cold. There was someone in the driver's seat now. A figure, dark and indistinct, hands on the steering wheel, head turned toward me. But I couldn't make out any features. Couldn't see a face or clothing or anything that would identify it as human. It was just a silhouette, a shadow in the shape of a person. I pressed down harder on my accelerator, trying to pull ahead, but the Freightliner matched my speed. The figure in the driver's seat continued to stare at me, motionless except for the small adjustments it made to the steering wheel. We drove like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, 2 trucks side by side on an empty highway in the middle of the night, one driven by a terrified human and the other by something that only resembled one. Then the figure raised its right hand and pointed forward, toward something on the road ahead. I looked where it was indicating and saw another one of those green signs coming up. Crossroads, 1 mile. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I wasn't going to follow that sign, wasn't going to turn off the highway no matter what happened. I'd made that mistake once before, and I wasn't going to make it again. But as I approached the 1 mile marker, I realized I might not have a choice. The 14 trucks behind me were closing ranks, tightening their formation, boxing me in. The Freightliner beside me drifted slightly toward my lane, forcing me toward the shoulder. I tried to brake, but the trucks behind me accelerated, their front bumpers getting dangerously close to my rear. I tried to speed up, but the Freightliner matched me and continued pushing me over. I was being herded, forced toward the turnoff that I knew would appear at the 2 mile mark. These trucks, these things that looked like trucks but clearly weren't, were guiding me toward the crossroads whether I wanted to go or not. I looked at my fuel gauge and saw I was down to a quarter tank. I'd been planning to fuel up in Fort Nelson, but that was still 3 hours away, and I wasn't going to make it with these trucks forcing me to maintain high speed. That's when I saw the other sign, a small brown marker that indicated a maintenance road coming up in half a mile. It was the kind of road used by highway crews to access remote sections for repairs, usually gated and locked, but it represented my only chance to break free from this convoy. I waited until the last possible moment, then yanked my steering wheel hard to the right, taking the maintenance road turnoff at a speed that made my truck lean dangerously. The convoy didn't follow. They continued straight on the highway, maintaining their formation, and within seconds they disappeared from view. I slowed my truck to a crawl, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my breath coming in short gasps. I'd escaped, at least temporarily, but I had no idea where this maintenance road led, or if it would even get me back to the highway. The road was unpaved and poorly maintained, full of potholes and washouts that forced me to creep along at maybe 10 miles per hour. My headlights revealed nothing but trees on both sides, dense forest that seemed to press in closer the further I drove. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see those headlights reappear behind me, but there was nothing except darkness. I'd been on the maintenance road for about 20 minutes when I noticed something odd about the trees. They were all leaning at the same angle, like they'd been pushed by some massive wind and frozen in that position. The angle was slight enough that I might not have noticed it in daylight, but my headlights cast long shadows that made it obvious, and they were all leaning toward the road, toward me, like they were trying to reach across the narrow gap and touch my truck. The temperature had dropped again, my dashboard now showing -52. At those temperatures, metal becomes brittle, diesel fuel turns to gel, and human flesh freezes in minutes. I had my heater running at full blast, but I could still feel the cold seeping into the cab, making my fingers numb and my breath come out in thick white clouds. I started to worry that my truck would break down out here, that I'd be stranded on this abandoned maintenance road with no way to call for help. That's when my headlights caught something on the road ahead. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a moose or a bear, but as I got closer I realized it was a person. They were standing in the middle of the road, facing away from me, completely motionless. I slowed to a stop about 30 feet away, and sat there with my engine idling, trying to decide what to do. The figure was wearing what looked like old trucker gear, a heavy winter coat and work boots, but something about their posture was wrong. They stood too straight, too rigid, like a statue rather than a living person. I honked my horn, and the sound echoed through the trees, but the figure didn't move. I honked again, longer this time, but got the same non-response. I was debating whether to turn around and try to find another route when the figure slowly began to turn toward me. The movement was wrong, mechanical, like they were pivoting on a fixed axis rather than naturally turning their body. And as they completed the rotation and faced my truck, I saw why their posture had seemed off. They had no face. Where there should have been eyes and a nose and a mouth, there was just smooth, blank skin, like an unfinished sculpture. I threw my truck into reverse and backed up as fast as I dared, not caring about the potholes or the risk of sliding off the road. The faceless figure didn't follow, just stood there in the beam of my headlights, watching me with eyes that didn't exist. I reversed for maybe a quarter mile before finding a spot wide enough to turn around, and then I drove back the way I'd come, pushing my truck to its absolute limit on the terrible road. When I reached the junction with the highway, I sat there for a long moment, trying to decide which direction to turn. North would take me back toward the convoy, toward that stretch of highway where the crossroads sign would be waiting. South would take me away from my destination, away from the load I was supposed to deliver, but it would also take me away from whatever was hunting me on these roads. I turned south. I'd lost loads before, and I could deal with whatever consequences came from abandoning this run. What I couldn't deal with was the certainty that if I continued north, if I saw that crossroads sign again, I wouldn't have the strength to ignore it. Something was pulling me toward that intersection, some force that grew stronger every time I encountered it, and I knew that if I gave in, if I followed those signs one more time, I wouldn't be coming back. I drove south for 6 hours straight, ignoring the growing fatigue and the pain in my lower back from sitting in the same position. I passed Fort Nelson without stopping, passed every rest area and pull-off, didn't even slow down for the small towns along the way. I just drove, putting as much distance as I could between myself and that stretch of highway where the crossroads waited. The sun came up around hour 4, and I'd never been so relieved to see daylight. The world looked normal again, highway and trees and distant mountains painted in shades of gray and white and blue. Other trucks appeared on the road, heading north with their loads, and I felt an overwhelming urge to warn them, to tell them about the crossroads and the signs and the convoy of ghost trucks. But I knew how it would sound, knew they'd think I'd lost my mind or been driving too long without sleep. I finally stopped in a town called Chetwynd, found a cheap motel and crashed for 14 hours straight. When I woke up, it was night again, and for a moment I panicked, thinking I was still out there on the highway, still being pursued by those empty trucks. But I could hear traffic outside my window, could see streetlights and neon signs, all the comfortable proof of civilization and normalcy. I was safe, at least for now. I called the company the next day and told them I'd had mechanical trouble, that I'd been forced to abandon the load and would need a few days to get my truck repaired. They weren't happy about it, but they didn't fire me either. I think the dispatcher could hear something in my voice that convinced her not to push too hard. I told her I'd call back when I was ready to take another run, but I had no idea if that was true. I spent a week in Chetwynd, just existing, trying to process what had happened. I'd start to convince myself that it had all been some kind of exhaustion-induced hallucination, that the isolation and stress had made me see things that weren't there. But then I'd remember details that were too specific, too real to be imaginary. The way that faceless figure had turned toward me, the perfect formation of the truck convoy, the exact wording on those green signs, none of it felt like a dream or a hallucination. It felt like memory, like documented fact. On the 8th day, I drove my truck to a garage and had them give it a complete inspection. I told the mechanic I wanted everything checked, every system tested, didn't care how much it cost. He looked at me like I was crazy but did the work anyway. When he was done, he told me my truck was in perfect condition, no mechanical issues at all. I thanked him and paid the bill, and then I just sat in my truck in the garage parking lot, staring at the steering wheel. The truck was fine. I was the one who was broken, the one who couldn't stop thinking about those roads, and that crossroads and those empty trucks with their mysterious drivers. I was the one who jumped every time I saw a green highway sign, who couldn't drive after dark without my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The highway had gotten into my head, planted something there that I couldn't dig out no matter how hard I tried. I eventually started taking loads again, but only short hauls on southern routes, runs that kept me close to populated areas where I could always see other vehicles and lights and signs of human presence. I avoided the northern highways completely, turned down any load that would take me within 100 miles of Highway 97. Other drivers noticed, started calling me soft, saying I'd lost my nerve. Maybe they were right. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed trying to fall asleep, I think about those tire tracks I saw at the crossroads. I think about how they'd been fresh, how they'd indicated another truck had been there recently, and I wonder if that other driver made it back, or if they went through the intersection and vanished like all the others. I wonder if they're still out there somewhere, driving an endless highway in some place that exists adjacent to our world but separate from it. And I think about the faceless figure standing on that maintenance road, about how it had turned toward me with mechanical precision, about how it had just stood there, watching me with eyes that didn't exist as I backed away in terror. I think about how it hadn't followed me, hadn't tried to pursue or attack, had just observed, like it was marking me somehow, taking note of my presence for future reference. 3 months after my encounter with the convoy, I broke my promise to myself and took a northern load. It wasn't a conscious decision, not really. The company needed someone to make an emergency run to Whitehorse, and the dispatcher called me at 2 a.m, desperate, offering double pay. I was half asleep when I agreed, and by the time I fully woke up and realized what I'd committed to, it was too late to back out without burning bridges I couldn't afford to burn. So I found myself loading up a trailer full of construction equipment, running through my pre-trip checklist with hands that shook just enough to be noticeable. It was late October, the first real cold snap of the season, with temperatures already dropping into the -30s at night. The weather forecast called for clear skies, good road conditions, all the comforting lies that meteorologists tell truckers who have to drive through regions where weather is less a forecast and more a suggestion. I told myself this run would be different. I'd stay on the main highway, wouldn't investigate any strange signs or sounds, wouldn't stop except for fuel and legally required breaks. I'd drive straight through, deliver my load, and get back to the southern routes as quickly as possible. It was a simple plan, and I repeated it to myself like a mantra as I pulled out of the depot just after 4 p.m., the sun already setting in that abbreviated way it does in northern latitudes during fall. The first 8 hours were uneventful. I passed Fort Nelson around midnight, fueled up, and continued north. The CB was active with normal chatter. Other drivers talking about hockey scores and complaining about the cold. I participated when they addressed me directly, kept my responses short and professional, didn't mention anything about crossroads or ghost convoys or faceless figures. Just another trucker making another run, nothing unusual about it at all. But around hour 10, as I approached the section of Highway 97, where I'd first seen that sign back in February, I started feeling it. A pull, an attraction, like there was a magnet somewhere off the highway drawing me toward it. It was subtle at first, just a slight urge to drift right, to let my truck veer toward the shoulder. I corrected my steering and shook my head, trying to clear it, telling myself it was just fatigue, just my imagination creating patterns where none existed. The pull got stronger. With every mile I drove, the attraction intensified, until I was gripping the steering wheel with both hands, actively fighting to keep my truck moving in a straight line. It felt like I was driving through mud, like the air itself had become resistant, trying to slow me down and push me toward something off the highway. My speedometer said I was doing 65, but it felt like I was barely crawling. That's when I saw it. Not the green sign this time, but something worse. There was a truck stopped on the shoulder ahead, hazards flashing, a figure standing next to the driver's side door. As my headlights swept across the scene, the figure turned toward me and waved, the universal signal for, "I need help." Every instinct I had screamed at me to keep driving, to not stop, to not get involved. But I couldn't do it. Some core part of my identity, the part that made me human, wouldn't let me drive past someone who needed assistance. I slowed my truck and pulled onto the shoulder about 50 feet behind the disabled vehicle. Through my windshield, I could see the figure more clearly now. It was a man in trucker gear, heavy coat and winter hat, standing in a posture that looked natural and human and completely normal. He waved at me again, then pointed at his truck's engine, making gestures that suggested mechanical trouble. I sat there with my engine idling, debating what to do, knowing this was probably a trap, but unable to ignore the possibility that it might be a real person who genuinely needed help. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from my cab, the cold hitting me with its usual intensity. I approached the other truck cautiously, keeping my distance, ready to run back to my own vehicle at the first sign of anything unusual. The man watched me approach, his face shadowed under his hat brim, his posture relaxed and unthreatening. When I was about 20 feet away, he spoke, his voice rough and gravelly, exactly how you'd expect a long-haul trucker to sound. "Engine's overheating," he said, jerking his thumb toward the hood of his truck. "Thought maybe you'd have some coolant I could borrow. I'm about 2 hours short of Port Nelson, and I don't think I'll make it without a top-up." It was a completely reasonable request, the kind of thing that happens on the highway all the time. Truckers help each other out, share supplies, provide assistance when someone's in trouble. It's an unwritten rule of the road, but something about this felt wrong. The man's truck was a Kenworth, maybe 20 years old, with Alberta plates that were so rusted I could barely read the numbers. And despite his claim that the engine was overheating, I couldn't see any steam or smoke coming from under the hood, couldn't hear the distinctive ticking sound that hot engines make. More than that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I recognized this truck from somewhere, that I'd seen it before in circumstances I couldn't quite remember. "Sure," I heard myself saying, my voice sounding distant and strange to my own ears. "I've got some coolant in my truck, let me grab it." I turned to walk back to my semi, and that's when I saw it. There were no tire tracks in the snow behind the Kenworth. The shoulder was covered in a thin layer of fresh powder, maybe an inch deep, and my own truck had left clear tracks when I'd pulled over. But the Kenworth sat on pristine snow, as if it had been placed there by a crane rather than driven into position. I stopped walking and turned back toward the man. He was still standing in the same spot, still watching me, but now that I was looking more carefully, I could see other things that were wrong. He cast no shadow, even though my truck's headlights were shining directly on him. His breath didn't come out in visible clouds, even though the temperature was -38. And now that I was paying attention, I realized he wasn't blinking. He just stood there with his eyes fixed on me, unmoving, waiting. "Who are you?" I asked, my hand tightening on my flashlight. The man tilted his head slightly and I heard a sound like creaking metal, like rusted hinges protesting movement. "I'm a trucker," he said. His voice still rough and gravelly, but now with an undertone that didn't sound quite human. "Same as you, just trying to get where I'm going, just trying to complete my run." I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on him, moving toward my truck. He didn't follow, didn't move at all, just stood there watching me with those unblinking eyes. When I reached my cab, I climbed in and locked the doors, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the locks. I looked through my windshield, and the man was gone. Not walked away, not gotten back in his truck, just gone. And the Kenworth was still sitting there, hazards still flashing, completely empty. I should have driven away right then, should have started my engine and gotten back on the highway and never looked back. But I didn't, because as I sat there staring at the empty truck, I finally remembered where I'd seen it before. It was one of the 14 trucks from the rest area, one of the vehicles in that ghost convoy that had pursued me 3 months ago. And that meant the man I'd just been talking to was one of the disappeared, one of the drivers who'd followed the signs to the crossroads and never made it back. The pull I'd been feeling intensified suddenly, becoming almost unbearable. It was like someone had wrapped a cable around my chest and was reeling me in, dragging me toward something just off the highway. I looked to my right and saw what I'd been dreading. A narrow opening in the tree line, a path that definitely hadn't been there before, and at its entrance, a green reflective sign that I knew would read, Crossroads. I tried to start my engine, but my hands wouldn't cooperate. They moved to the ignition, turned the key, but there was no strength in them, no control. It was like I was watching someone else operate my body, some puppet master pulling strings I couldn't see. The engine turned over once, twice, then died. I tried again, and the same thing happened. My truck, which had been running perfectly fine 30 seconds ago, wouldn't start. The path was calling to me. Not literally, not with words or sounds, but with something deeper and more fundamental than language. It was promising me answers, understanding, an end to the confusion and fear that had plagued me since my first encounter with the crossroads. All I had to do was get out of my truck, walk down that path, and find the intersection where everything would finally make sense. My hand reached for the door handle, and I watched it move like it belonged to someone else. The logical part of my brain was screaming, telling me to stop, to fight this compulsion, to do anything except what I was about to do. But the pull was too strong, the attraction too powerful. I'd been resisting it for months, and I was tired of fighting. Maybe it would be a relief to finally give in, to see where that path led and what waited at its end. The door opened, and cold air flooded into the cab. I stepped down onto the shoulder, my boots crunching in the snow, and started walking toward the path. Each step felt lighter than the last, like I was shedding weight with every movement. The fear that had been my constant companion for months was fading, replaced by a strange sense of anticipation, almost excitement. I was finally going to see it, finally going to understand what all of this meant. I reached the entrance to the path and paused, looking back at my truck one last time. It sat there on the shoulder, hazards flashing, driver's door hanging open, looking exactly like all those other abandoned trucks I'd seen. In some distant part of my mind, I understood that I was making the same choice all those other drivers had made, that I was becoming another disappearance, another mystery on Highway 97. But that understanding felt academic, unimportant, like it was happening to someone else. The path stretched out before me, disappearing into darkness between the trees. I could see another one of those green signs about 50 yards ahead, and beyond it, what might have been a faint glow, like distant headlights or dawn breaking in the wrong direction. I took a step forward, then another, feeling the pull intensify with each movement. It was almost painful now, this attraction, like my entire being was being stretched toward something just out of sight. And then I heard it, a voice on my CB radio, distant and crackling with static, but unmistakably real. Northbound 87. This is southbound 29. Do you copy? I stopped walking, the pull on me loosening slightly. The voice continued, more urgent now. Northbound 87. If you can hear this, do not leave your truck. Stay on the highway. The path is not what you think it is. I turned and looked back at my truck. At the CB radio, I could see through the open door. The rational part of my brain surged back to life, fighting against the compulsion that had nearly controlled me completely. This was real. This voice on the radio. Another driver trying to warn me the same way I'd tried to warn that other trucker 3 months ago. And if they were warning me, that meant they knew something, had seen something that I needed to hear. I took a step back toward my truck, and the pull resisted, trying to hold me in place. But now that I was fighting it consciously, aware of what it was doing, I found I had some measure of control. I took another step, then another, each one harder than the last, like I was walking through water that grew thicker and more resistant with every movement. The CB continued to crackle, the voice still calling my signal, giving me something to focus on, something to anchor myself to. When I reached my truck, I grabbed the door frame and pulled myself into the cab, slamming the door shut behind me. Immediately, the pull released, and I gasped like I'd been holding my breath underwater. I grabbed the CB mic with shaking hands and keyed it. "This is northbound 87, I copy. Who is this?" Static answered me for a long moment, and I started to think I'd imagined the voice entirely, but then it came back, clearer now. "Doesn't matter who I am. What matters is you're still in your truck. Now start your engine and get back on the highway. Don't look at the path. Don't think about where it leads. Just drive." I turned my ignition key, and my engine roared to life on the first try, like it had never failed. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, accelerating hard, needing to put distance between myself and that path. As I drove away, I looked in my mirror and saw the Kenworth was gone, the shoulder empty except for my tire tracks, and the path between the trees had vanished, the tree line unbroken and solid. "Thank you," I said into the CB, but there was no response, just static. I tried calling out several more times over the next hour, but the voice never came back. I don't know if it was a real driver who'd seen my truck sitting there and decided to check on me, or something else, something that wanted to pull me back from whatever edge I'd been standing on. Either way, it had saved me from whatever fate awaited at the crossroads. I completed my run to Whitehorse without any other incidents, dropped off my load, and immediately headed back south. I drove straight through, stopping only for fuel and legally required breaks, not trusting myself to stop anywhere that I might be pulled back toward that path. When I finally made it back to the company depot 3 days later, I walked into the dispatcher's office and quit on the spot. That was 8 months ago. I haven't been on a highway since then, haven't even driven my personal vehicle at night. I got a job at a warehouse, loading trucks instead of driving them, and I tell people I retired from trucking for medical reasons, which isn't entirely a lie. Something inside me broke on that last run, some essential part of my navigation system that let me trust the roads and trust myself. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night, the detail I can't stop thinking about. When I got back to the depot and the mechanics inspected my truck, they found something odd. My odometer showed I'd driven exactly 2,847 miles during that run, but when they checked the GPS logs and fuel consumption, the numbers didn't match. According to those records, I'd actually driven closer to 3,200 miles. There's about 350 miles missing from my odometer. 350 miles that I drove, but that my truck didn't record. And I've been going over my logs and my memories of that trip, trying to figure out when those miles disappeared, when I might have driven through some section of highway that existed outside normal space. But I can't find it. As far as I can remember, I was on Highway 97 the entire time, following the same route I'd driven dozens of times before, which means those 350 miles happened somewhere I can't remember. Some stretch of road that my brain has blocked out or edited away. I think about that voice on the CB sometimes, the one that warned me to stay in my truck. I wonder if they'd experienced the same thing, if they'd been pulled toward that path and managed to resist, or if they'd gone through and somehow made it back. I wonder if there are other drivers out there who know about the crossroads, who've encountered it and survived to tell the tale. Or if I'm the only one, the only driver who got close enough to see what it was, but still managed to walk away. Last week, I saw a news story about another trucker gone missing on Highway 97. His truck was found at a rest area, engine still running, personal belongings intact, no sign of the driver anywhere. The police are calling it suspicious, investigating it as a possible abduction or foul play. But I know better. I know he saw the signs, followed the path, found the crossroads, and I know he's not coming back. Sometimes I think about going back up there, trying to find that section of highway where I first saw the sign, trying to understand what the crossroads actually is and why it hunts drivers on the northern routes. But that's just fantasy, just my brain trying to create some sense of closure where none exists. The truth is, I'm too afraid to ever drive those roads again. Too afraid of what I might see, what I might be compelled to do. Because here's what really terrifies me. When I was walking down that path, when I was being pulled towards the crossroads, part of me wanted to go. Part of me still wants to go. And I don't know if that desire comes from the crossroads itself, from whatever force operates through those signs and paths, or if it comes from something inside me, some self-destructive impulse that the crossroads recognized and exploited. I keep a map of Highway 97 in my apartment now, pinned to the wall above my desk. I've marked all the locations where I encountered the signs, where I saw the paths, where other drivers have disappeared. I'm looking for a pattern, some logic to when and where the crossroads appears, but there isn't one. Or if there is, it's beyond my ability to comprehend. The crossroads shows itself when it wants to whoever it chooses, and no amount of mapping or analysis can predict or prevent it. Last night, I dreamed I was back on Highway 97. I was driving my truck through the darkness and I saw that green sign ahead. Crossroads, 2 miles. But this time, instead of fear, I felt relief. Like I was finally going home after a long absence. Like the crossroads wasn't hunting me, but waiting for me, patient and eternal. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that someday I would go back. Not today, not this year, maybe not for decades. But eventually I would find myself on that highway again, and this time I wouldn't resist. This time I would follow the path all the way to the end. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, but the dream stayed with me. It stays with me still, as I sit here writing this account, trying to create some record of what I experienced in case anyone else encounters the same thing. But even as I write, I can feel it pulling at me, that same attraction I felt on the highway. It's fainter now, diluted by distance and time, but it's still there, still waiting. My name is Mason Garrett, and I've been running freight through the Yukon and Northwest Territories for the better part of 9 years. Most people think trucking is a simple job, just pointing a vehicle in one direction and keeping it between the lines until you reach your destination. But up here in the territories, where winter lasts 8 months and the darkness swallows everything from November through February, trucking becomes something else entirely. It becomes a test of your ability to stay human when every external condition is trying to convince you that you're the last person alive on Earth. I learned to drive from my old man, who spent 30 years hauling loads through these same frozen wastelands before his heart gave out during a run to Inuvik. They found him slumped over his steering wheel at a rest stop, engine still running, heater keeping his body warm for the 6 hours it took for another driver to find him. That's the way I want to go, if I'm being honest. Quick, clean, still in the driver's seat. Better than wasting away in some hospital bed, tubes running in and out of you, strangers deciding when you've suffered enough. The run I'm about to describe happened in January of this year, during what the Weather Service was calling an unprecedented Arctic outbreak. Temperatures across the territories had dropped to levels usually only seen in February, hitting -55 in some areas, -62 in others. The kind of cold where exposed skin freezes in under 2 minutes, where your breath crystallizes and falls to the ground like snow, where the air itself seems to solidify into something you have to push through rather than breathe. I'd been hired to haul mining equipment from Whitehorse up to a new operation near the Beaufort Sea. A 30-hour drive under good conditions. But these weren't good conditions. The forecast called for intermittent whiteout conditions, winds gusting up to 70 kilometers per hour, and temperatures that would make diesel fuel gel unless you kept your engine running continuously. Smart drivers were declining the run, telling the company to wait for better weather. But I needed the money. And more than that, I needed to prove something to myself. That I was as tough as my old man had been, that I could handle whatever the North threw at me. I loaded up on a Tuesday morning, checking my equipment 3 times to make sure everything was secure and functional. Extra diesel fuel, blankets, emergency supplies, a satellite phone in case my regular cell lost signal. I'd driven this route maybe 15 times before, knew every rest stop and fuel depot, every stretch where the highway narrowed or wound through particularly treacherous terrain. I felt prepared, felt confident, felt like this was just another run despite what the thermometer was saying. The first 6 hours went smoothly. I left Whitehorse around 10 a.m., and by the time darkness fell at 3 p.m. I was making good time, ahead of schedule even. The highway was mostly empty, just a few other rigs heading south and the occasional truck heading north like me. We'd flash our high beams at each other when passing, that small acknowledgement that we weren't completely alone out here. The CB radio was quiet but functional. Occasional chatter about road conditions and weather updates. Nothing unusual. Around hour 8, just past the small community of Ross River, the snow started. Not the gentle flurries you see on Christmas cards, but serious snow, thick and heavy, reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet. I slowed down, turned on my hazards, and settled in for what I knew would be a long slog through the storm. This was standard winter driving in the territories. Nothing I hadn't handled dozens of times before. You just had to be patient, keep your speed reasonable, and trust your instincts about where the road was even when you couldn't see it clearly. The CB started acting up around hour 9. The chatter I'd been hearing faded into static. Not dead air, but active interference. White noise that would occasionally resolve into something that almost sounded like words before dissolving back into meaninglessness. I cycled through the channels, trying to find one that was clear, but they were all the same. Just static, constant, and unvarying, filling my cab with noise that made it hard to think. I was reaching for the radio to turn it off when I heard it. A voice, barely audible under the static, speaking a single word. Mason. My name. Clear as a bell despite the interference, unmistakable. I grabbed the CB mic and keyed it, asking who was trying to reach me, giving my call sign and position. But there was no response, just more static, that endless white noise that seemed to press against my eardrums. I told myself it was nothing, just my brain creating patterns and random noise the way humans always do. We're pattern recognition machines, finding faces in clouds and messages in static. There's a term for it, pareidolia, and it's perfectly normal, perfectly explainable. The isolation was getting to me, making me hear things that weren't there. I turned the CB volume down and focused on the road ahead, where my headlights were revealing nothing but snow and more snow. But 20 minutes later, it happened again. The static resolved briefly into that same voice, speaking my name with what sounded like urgency. Mason. This time I was certain I'd heard it, certain it wasn't my imagination. I turned the volume back up and listened carefully, waiting for it to happen again. The static continued, unbroken and monotonous, for several minutes. Then, just as I was starting to think I'd imagined the whole thing, it came back. Mason, can you hear me? I keyed the mic immediately. This is Mason Garrett, call sign northbound 66. Who is this? What channel are you on? Nothing but static answered me. I tried again, more insistently this time, demanding identification, asking if this was an emergency. Still nothing. The voice didn't come back, and after a few more minutes of listening to white noise, I turned the CB off entirely. If someone was really trying to reach me, they'd use my cell phone or the satellite phone. This was just some kind of radio interference, maybe a skip from a distant station bouncing off the atmosphere in weird ways. The snow was getting heavier, the wind picking up, pushing against the side of my truck and making it drift toward the shoulder. I corrected constantly, both hands on the wheel, my eyes straining to pick out the road through the nearly opaque curtain of white. Visibility had dropped to maybe 15 feet, and I was considering pulling over to wait out the worst of the storm when I noticed something odd about my GPS. The little blue dot that represented my truck was moving normally, tracking along the highway as expected. But the route ahead of it, the red line that showed my planned path, was flickering. Not dramatically, just subtle pulses where the line would disappear for a fraction of a second before reappearing. I tapped the screen, thinking it might be a glitch, but the flickering continued. And then, as I watched, the red line changed course slightly, showing a route that deviated from the highway by maybe half a mile before rejoining it further north. I zoomed in on the map, trying to see if there was some kind of alternate route or bypass that I wasn't aware of. But according to the GPS, there was nothing there except empty terrain, no roads or trails or any indication of human development. Yet, the device was insisting I should take this detour, that it would save me time and distance. I watched the flickering line for another minute before deciding to ignore it. GPS units malfunction all the time, especially in extreme cold, and I wasn't about to start following phantom routes just because my technology was acting up. I'd been driving for maybe 10 more minutes when the CB turned itself back on. I hadn't touched it, my hands were both on the steering wheel, but suddenly the static was back, filling the cab with noise. And underneath that static, clearer now than before, I heard the voice again. "Mason, you need to listen to me. Take the next road on your right. It's important." My hands tightened on the wheel. This wasn't radio interference, wasn't atmospheric skip or pareidolia. This was a deliberate transmission, someone using my CB frequency to contact me specifically. But that didn't make sense. CB radios have a range of maybe 20 miles under ideal conditions, much less in a snowstorm with all this terrain interfering with the signal. There were no other vehicles anywhere near me. I hadn't seen another truck in over an hour. And there were no towns or settlements for at least 50 miles in any direction. "Who is this?" I said aloud, not bothering with the mic. If they could broadcast to me, maybe they could hear me too. "How do you know my name?" The static continued, unchanging, offering no answers. I waited, my breath coming faster than it should, my heart rate elevated. After what felt like minutes but was probably only 30 seconds, the voice came back. "There's not much time. You need to get off the main highway. Take the next right turn you see." I looked at my GPS. The flickering red line was still there, still showing that impossible detour. And as I watched, my position on the map approached what looked like a junction, a place where another road branched off to the right. But I knew this highway, knew this section, and there was no junction here. Nothing but empty wilderness for miles. Yet the GPS was showing it clearly, and the voice on the CB was telling me to take it. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to ignore both the GPS and the voice, to keep driving straight, to trust my knowledge of the road over these malfunctioning devices. But there was something about the voice that made me hesitate. It didn't sound malicious or threatening. It sounded worried, urgent, like someone trying to warn me about danger ahead. And despite my rational mind telling me this was impossible, some deeper part of my consciousness was responding to that urgency. I slowed my truck, my high beams cutting through the snow, searching for any sign of a turnoff or side road. At first, I saw nothing, just the usual tree line on both sides of the highway. But then, so gradually, I almost missed it. A gap appeared in the trees on my right. Not a proper road, just a break in the forest. A space where the trees had been cleared or had never grown. And there, barely visible in the storm, was what looked like tire tracks leading into that gap. The rational part of my brain was telling me to keep driving, that following mysterious roads based on phantom GPS routes and voices on the CB was insanity. But I found myself turning the wheel anyway, following those tracks into the gap, leaving the highway behind. The snow was deeper here, no plows or traffic to pack it down, and my truck slowed to a crawl as it pushed through the accumulation. The trees closed in on both sides, branches heavy with snow, creating a tunnel effect that made the storm seem even more oppressive. I drove like that for maybe 5 minutes, following the tracks, wondering what the hell I was doing and why I'd allowed myself to be convinced to leave the main road. The voice on the CB had gone silent, just static again, and my GPS was showing nothing but blank terrain with no roads or landmarks. I was completely off the map now, following some path through the wilderness based on nothing but a mysterious voice and my own poor judgment. That's when I heard the explosion behind me. Not close, maybe a couple miles back, but unmistakable. A deep, rumbling boom that I felt through the frame of my truck more than heard with my ears. I stopped and looked in my mirrors, and I could see an orange glow in the distance, flames reflecting off the low cloud cover. Something on the highway had exploded, something big, and if I'd stayed on my route, I would have driven right into it. The voice came back on the CB, sounding relieved. "You're safe now. Keep following this road. It'll rejoin the highway in about 3 miles past the accident site." I sat there with my engine idling, staring at the orange glow in my mirrors, trying to process what had just happened. Someone, somehow, had known there was danger ahead and had warned me, had gotten me off the highway just in time to avoid whatever catastrophe had occurred back there. "Who are you?" I asked again, this time keying the mic properly. "How did you know that was going to happen?" The static crackled and shifted, and for a moment I thought I heard multiple voices layered on top of each other, all speaking at once in words I couldn't quite make out. Then the static cleared slightly and the original voice came through. "I'm someone who's been where you are. Someone who knows these roads better than you think. Just keep driving, Mason. Follow the tracks. You'll be back on the highway soon." I did as instructed, following the tire tracks through the snow, my mind racing with questions that had no good answers. After about 10 minutes, the trees began to thin out, and I could see the highway ahead, the familiar gray strip cutting through the white landscape. I pulled back onto the main road and continued north, my hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. In my mirrors, I could still see that orange glow in the distance, whatever was burning back there still ablaze. I tried calling the authorities on my satellite phone, reporting the explosion and giving them the approximate location. The dispatcher said they'd send emergency services to investigate, asked me if I was all right, if I needed assistance. I told them I was fine, that I'd taken a detour and missed whatever had happened. They thanked me for the report and told me to drive carefully. Standard procedure, standard response. Nothing that acknowledged how impossible the entire situation was. The CB was silent now, just dead air, no static or voices or any indication that it was even functional. I tried transmitting, calling out to the mysterious voice that had warned me, but got no response. It was like the frequency had been abandoned, like whatever presence had been using it to contact me had served its purpose and moved on. I left the radio on anyway, volume turned up, hoping to hear that voice again, hoping for some explanation of what had just happened. None came. I drove through the night, following Highway 1 as it wound north through the mountains and valleys, the storm gradually lessening until it was just light snow falling rather than the whiteout conditions I'd been dealing with. Other trucks appeared on the road, heading south, and when we passed each other and flashed high beams, everything felt normal again. Like the previous hour had been some kind of fever dream, some hallucination brought on by isolation and cold and the hypnotic effect of driving through endless white. But it wasn't a hallucination. I learned that the next morning when I stopped for fuel at a depot in Mayo. The woman behind the counter asked me if I'd heard about the accident on Highway 1. Said it had been all over the news. A propane tanker had jackknifed and exploded, taking out 2 other vehicles and closing the highway for 8 hours. 3 people had died, burned beyond recognition. The accident had happened right around the time I would have been passing through that section if I'd stayed on my original road. I asked her if they knew what had caused the tanker to jackknife, and she said the investigation was still ongoing, but preliminary reports suggested the driver had swerved to avoid something in the road. Something he'd reported seeing over his CB radio moments before the crash, though nobody could confirm what it was. His last transmission had been garbled, mostly static, but the investigators had managed to extract a few words. Someone in the road, someone waving, can't stop in time. I felt my stomach drop. Someone in the road, someone waving them down, causing them to swerve, causing the accident. And I'd been warned to take a detour, to get off the highway before I encountered whatever that driver had seen. The voice on the CB had saved my life, but it hadn't saved the others. Or maybe it had tried to warn them too, and they hadn't listened. Maybe that's what the driver had heard over his CB, that same voice I'd heard trying to tell him to change course. I finished fueling and got back on the road, my mind churning with questions that seemed to multiply faster than I could process them. Who was broadcasting on that CB frequency? How had they known about the accident before it happened? And why had they specifically warned me, used my name, made sure I understood the urgency? I was just one driver among hundreds making runs through the territories. What made me special enough to deserve a personal warning? The more I thought about it, the more disturbed I became. Because the implication was clear. Someone or something was watching the highways, monitoring CB frequencies, aware of impending disasters. And they could choose who to warn and who to let die. The propane tanker driver and his passengers hadn't received a warning, or if they had, they'd received it too late to act on. But I'd been given plenty of advance notice, plenty of time to take that detour and save myself. I drove the rest of that day in silence, the CB turned off, not wanting to hear any more voices or receive any more warnings. I completed my delivery to the mining operation without incident, turned around, and headed back south. The return trip was uneventful, normal winter driving conditions. No explosions, or mysterious voices, or impossible detours. Just me and the highway and the endless white landscape rolling past my windows. But I couldn't stop thinking about that voice, the way it had said my name, intimate and familiar, like we'd known each other for years. The concern in its tone when it warned me about the danger ahead. And most disturbing of all, the way it had said, "I'm someone who's been where you are." Past tense. Been. Not, "I am where you are," but "I've been." Like the speaker was no longer driving these roads, no longer operating in the same physical space I occupied. I took a week off after that run. Told the company I needed to deal with some personal issues. Spent most of that time in my apartment in Whitehorse, drinking too much coffee and researching CB radio anomalies, trying to find some rational explanation for what had happened. The internet was full of stories about weird radio transmissions, ghost stations broadcasting on frequencies that should be empty, voices speaking in dead languages or delivering coded messages that made no sense, but none of them quite matched my experience. Most of the documented anomalies were recorded, repeating broadcasts that played the same message over and over. What I'd heard was interactive, responsive, a two-way conversation where the voice had known my name and had provided specific, timely information. That suggested either a living person with access to information they shouldn't have, or something else entirely, something that didn't fit into comfortable categories of natural or explicable. I found myself checking the news obsessively, looking for information about the tanker explosion and its aftermath. The official investigation concluded it had been an accident, driver error compounded by poor weather conditions. The driver had swerved to avoid what he thought was a person in the road, overcorrected, and lost control of his vehicle. The subsequent explosion had been caused by a ruptured propane tank, and the 3 deaths had been ruled accidental. No criminal charges, no indication of foul play, just another tragedy on Canada's notoriously dangerous northern highways. But there was one detail in the official report that caught my attention. Multiple drivers in the area at the time of the accident had reported unusual CB radio interference, static and garbled transmissions that made normal communication difficult. Some had described hearing voices underneath the static, words they couldn't quite make out, like someone trying to break through on an encrypted frequency. The investigators had attributed this to atmospheric conditions and solar activity, both of which could cause radio anomalies. I knew better. Those other drivers had been hearing the same thing I had, that same voice trying to warn them about the danger ahead. But they dismissed it as interference, as natural phenomena, and had driven right into the disaster. I'd been the only one who'd listened, who'd acted on the warning. And now I was alive while 3 others weren't. Survivor's guilt is a strange thing, even when your survival was entirely a matter of being in the right place at the right time. On the 6th day of my time off, I received a call from a driver named Jackson Sloan, who I'd worked with occasionally over the years. We weren't close friends, but we'd shared enough late-night CB conversations and truck stop meals to have developed a professional respect for each other. He said he'd heard about the tanker explosion, had heard I'd been on that highway around the same time, wanted to make sure I was okay. I told him I was fine, that I'd taken a detour and missed the whole thing. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Jackson said something that made my blood run cold. "You heard the broadcast too, didn't you?" The voice on the CB. I asked him what he meant, playing dumb, not wanting to admit to anything until I understood what he knew. He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Come on, Mason. I've been driving these routes for 16 years. I know when someone's been contacted. It happened to me 3 years ago, north of Norman Wells. Voice on the CB knew my name, told me to pull over and check my trailer. Saved my life. One of my tire chains had broken and was about to tear through my fuel line. I sat down, my legs suddenly unsteady. Another driver, another mysterious voice, another intervention that prevented disaster. This wasn't an isolated incident, wasn't something unique to me or to that particular stretch of highway. It was a pattern, a phenomenon that had been occurring for years, maybe longer. I asked Jackson if he knew what was causing it, if he'd figured out who or what was broadcasting those warnings. He was quiet for a moment before responding. "I don't know what it is," he said slowly. "But I've talked to other drivers quietly over the years, guys who've had similar experiences, and we've noticed something. The voice only reaches people who've lost someone to these highways. Your old man died on a run to Inuvik, right? My brother crashed his rig on black ice outside Dawson back in 2009. Every driver I've talked to who's heard the voice has lost family or close friends to these roads." The implication hit me like a physical blow. The voice knew my name because it knew my history, knew about my father's death, knew I had a personal connection to these highways that went deeper than just employment. And it had chosen to warn me, to save me, because of that connection. But that raised even more disturbing questions. How did it have access to that information? And what did it want in return for its intervention? I asked Jackson if the voice had ever contacted him again after that first time, and he said no. One warning, One intervention, then silence. He'd driven those same routes dozens of times since then, always listening carefully to his CB, waiting for another transmission. But there'd been nothing, just normal radio chatter and occasional static. It was like the voice had served its purpose with him and moved on to other drivers who needed warnings. We talked for another 30 minutes, sharing theories and speculation, neither of us willing to commit to any explanation that felt complete or satisfying. Jackson suggested I keep a recorder running on my CB frequency whenever I was driving, capture any future transmissions for analysis. I agreed that was a good idea, though part of me didn't want to hear that voice again. Didn't want to be reminded of how close I'd come to burning alive in a propane explosion. Before we hung up, Jackson said something that's stayed with me. Listen, Mason, if the voice contacts you again, pay attention to what it tells you. But be careful about following all its instructions blindly. Some of the drivers I've talked to think it's benevolent, think it's trying to help. But others aren't so sure. They think it might be testing us, seeing who'll listen and who won't, collecting data for purposes we don't understand. Whatever it is, it's not human. And things that aren't human don't necessarily have our best interests at heart. I went back to work the following week, taking a shorter run to Dawson that kept me on well-traveled routes with plenty of other traffic. I installed a digital recorder on my CB radio like Jackson had suggested, set it to capture anything broadcast on the standard frequencies. For the first few days, all it recorded was normal trucker chatter, weather updates, complaints about fuel prices and road conditions. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested the voice was trying to contact me. But on my fourth run, a late-night haul from Whitehorse to Ross River, the transmission started again. It was just after midnight, temperature hovering around -48, and I was the only vehicle on the highway. The CB had been quiet for over an hour when suddenly it crackled to life with that familiar static. And underneath the static, barely audible, I heard it. Mason, I need to talk to you. I grabbed the recorder and made sure it was capturing everything, then keyed my mic. I'm listening. Who are you? What do you want? The static shifted and pulsed, and I had the distinct impression of multiple voices trying to speak simultaneously, all competing for dominance on the frequency. Then one voice pushed through, clearer than before. I'm a driver, like you. I've been running these routes for longer than you can imagine, and I'm trying to help you understand what's coming. I asked what was coming, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. There was a long pause, filled only with that underlying static, before the voice responded. The highways are changing, Mason. They've always been dangerous, but now they're becoming something else. Something alive. Something hungry. And drivers like you and me, we're caught in the middle of it. We can either learn to navigate the new rules, or we can become part of the road ourselves. The temperature in my cab seemed to drop despite my heater running at full blast. I could see my breath misting in the air, could feel frost forming on the inside of my windows. And my GPS was acting up again, the screen flickering and showing routes that didn't exist, paths that wound through terrain where no roads could possibly be. I asked the voice to clarify what it meant by the highways becoming alive, but the static surged and drowned out any response. When the transmission cleared again, it was a different voice, similar to the first but subtly wrong, like a recording played at the wrong speed. Don't listen to him, Mason. He's trying to confuse you, trying to pull you into the same trap that got him. The highways aren't alive. But something lives in them now, something that feeds on drivers who stop paying attention, who let their guard down. You need to stay alert, stay skeptical. Don't trust anything you hear on this frequency. A third voice joined in, and then a fourth, and suddenly my CB was filled with overlapping transmissions, all of them claiming to be helping me, all of them warning me about different threats and dangers. Some said the highways were haunted by the ghosts of dead truckers. Others claimed there was a predator stalking the northern routes. Still others insisted this was all a government experiment in psychological manipulation. The cacophony was overwhelming, making it impossible to think clearly. I reached over and turned the CB volume down, but the voices didn't fade. They continued at the same level, as if the sound was coming from inside my head rather than through the radio speaker. And then, suddenly, they all stopped. Complete silence, no static, no transmissions, nothing. Just me and my truck and the empty highway stretching ahead into darkness. I drove in that silence for maybe 10 minutes, my heart rate slowly returning to normal, my breathing evening out. I checked my recorder and saw it had captured everything. The multiple voices and their conflicting warnings all preserved on digital storage. I'd listen to it later, try to make sense of what I'd heard, try to identify patterns or clues that might explain what was happening. But right now I just needed to focus on the road, on maintaining my speed and staying between the lines. The CB crackled back to life with a single voice, the original one I'd heard, the one that had warned me about the propane tanker. "I'm sorry about that, Mason. Sometimes the frequency gets crowded, other entities, trying to use it for their own purposes. You need to learn to distinguish between helpful warnings and malicious misdirection. Not every voice you hear on this channel has your best interests in mind." I asked how I was supposed to tell the difference, how I could know which transmissions to trust. The voice was quiet for a long moment before responding. "You'll learn. You'll develop an instinct for it, a sense of which warnings are genuine and which are traps. But it takes time and it takes practice. And sometimes you'll make mistakes. Some drivers don't survive their learning curve." That was meant to be reassuring, but it had the opposite effect. I was being told that I'd entered some kind of deadly game where the rules weren't clear and the penalties for failure were permanent. And I hadn't asked to play, hadn't volunteered for this. It had been thrust upon me simply because I drove these highways and had lost someone to them. It felt profoundly unfair, cosmically unjust. The voice continued. "The next time you stop for fuel or supplies, check your logbook. Look at the dates and times, see if they match your memory. That's usually the first sign that the highway is starting to take hold, when time begins to slip and bend. If you notice inconsistencies, if hours are missing or added without explanation, you need to be extra careful. That means you're becoming visible to things that hunt along these routes." I didn't want to check my logbook. I wanted to pretend I hadn't heard that instruction, wanted to maintain the comfortable fiction that time was linear and consistent and that my records would match reality. But I knew I'd check it anyway, knew I wouldn't be able to resist. The human mind can't ignore a warning like that, can't help but look for confirmation of its worst fears. The voice seemed to sense my reluctance. "I know this is a lot to process, Mason. I know it feels overwhelming. But you were chosen for this specifically because you have the strength to handle it. Your father runs through these territories for 30 years before his heart gave out. He saw things too, heard things, learned to navigate the strangeness. And he survived longer than most. You have his blood in you, his instincts. Trust them." The mention of my father hit me harder than I expected. I'd never told anyone details about his death, had barely talked about him at all in the years since his heart attack. And yet, this voice knew, had access to information about my family history that should have been private. It was invasive and unsettling and made me question everything I'd been told about who was broadcasting these transmissions and why. "How do you know about my father?" I demanded, keying the mic with more force than necessary. Who are you, really? What do you want from me? The static surged again, that now familiar sound of interference and competing signals. When the voice came back, it sounded tired, strained. I know about your father because I knew your father, Mason. I rode with him on runs up to Tuktoyaktuk, shared meals at truck stops along the way. He was a good man, a strong driver, and when the highway finally got him, when his heart couldn't take the strain anymore, he asked me to watch out for you if you ever started running these roads. So that's what I'm doing, keeping a promise to a dead friend. I wanted to believe that. Wanted to think this was all some elaborate but benevolent arrangement my father had made before his death, ensuring I'd have protection on these dangerous highways. But something about it felt wrong, felt too convenient. My father had died 9 years ago, and I'd been driving professionally for all of that time. Why had this mysterious benefactor waited until now to contact me? What had changed that made me suddenly worthy of protection? I asked these questions aloud, and the voice was silent for a long time before responding. When it finally spoke, the words came slowly, carefully chosen. You've been on these highways for 9 years, but you've only recently started running the deep northern routes, the ones that go beyond Fort McPherson and into the real wilderness. Those roads are different, Mason. They're older, wilder. The rules that apply to the southern highways don't always work up there. Your father knew that, had learned to navigate those differences. And now you need to learn too, because you've crossed a threshold you can't uncross. The cab felt colder still, and I realized my heater had stopped working. The vents were blowing air, but it was the same temperature as the outside atmosphere, minus 48 degrees of Arctic wind filling my truck. I fumbled with the controls, trying to restore heat, but nothing responded. And my windows were frosting over from the inside, ice crystals forming intricate patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like writing in some language I couldn't read. I was starting to panic, my breath coming in short gasps, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. If the heat didn't come back, I'd freeze to death within 20 minutes, maybe less. My emergency blankets and supplies were in the sleeper berth behind me, but I couldn't stop to retrieve them. Couldn't risk pulling over on this empty highway where anything might be waiting. I needed to keep moving, needed to maintain speed and hope my heater repaired itself, or my body heat would at least keep the cab warm enough to survive. The voice on the CB seemed to sense my distress. Your heater's fine, Mason. The mechanism works. What you're experiencing is something else, a temperature drop that has nothing to do with machinery. It's the highway responding to your fear, testing you, seeing if you'll panic and make mistakes. You need to calm down, control your breathing, and drive through it. The cold will pass. I tried to follow the instructions, forcing my breathing to slow, loosening my death grip on the steering wheel. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, maintaining composure while feeling my extremities start to go numb, while watching ice spread across my windshield and reduce my visibility to almost nothing. But gradually, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes, I felt warmth start to return. The vents began blowing heated air again, and the ice on my windows started to melt and drip down in rivulets. Good, the voice said approvingly. You passed the first test. There will be others, Mason, many others. But if you can stay calm like that, if you can control your fear response, you'll survive them. Most drivers panic, most drivers die. You're already doing better than average. I didn't feel like I was doing better than anything. I felt like I was barely holding myself together, like I was one more impossible event away from complete breakdown. But I kept driving, kept my truck moving north through the darkness, because the alternative was to stop and admit I couldn't handle this. And I wasn't ready to admit that yet. The rest of that run passed without major incident. Just occasional static on the CB and moments where my GPS would show impossible routes before correcting itself. I delivered my load to Ross River, turned around, and headed back to Whitehorse. By the time I pulled into the depot, I'd been driving for 18 hours straight and was exhausted in ways that went beyond just physical fatigue. I felt hollowed out, emptied, like something essential had been removed from my core. I listened to the recording from my CB that night, sitting in my apartment with headphones on, trying to catch every nuance and detail. The multiple voices were clear on the playback, distinguishable from each other despite the interference. But what disturbed me most was something I only noticed on the recording, something I hadn't caught during the actual transmissions. Underneath all the voices, behind the static and the words, there was another sound. A low, rhythmic pulsing that sounded almost like a heartbeat, or maybe an engine, but with a quality that was organic and mechanical at the same time. I played that section back multiple times, isolating the frequency, trying to identify what I was hearing. And the more I listened, the more certain I became that it wasn't background noise or interference. It was deliberate, intentional, a signal embedded beneath the surface layer of the transmissions. And it was saying something, conveying information in a language or code I couldn't consciously understand, but that my subconscious seemed to recognize. I had dreams that night, vivid and disturbing. I was driving through a snowstorm, following a highway that stretched endlessly in both directions. But when I looked more closely, I realized the highway itself was moving, undulating like a snake, and what I'd thought were mile markers were actually ribs, bones pressing up through asphalt skin. And all around me, other trucks were driving in perfect formation, but when I looked into their cabs, they were empty. No drivers, no passengers, just vehicles operating autonomously, heading toward some destination beyond the horizon. I woke up in a cold sweat, my sheets tangled around me, my heart pounding. It was 3:47 a.m., the dead hour, the time when human vitality is at its lowest, and the veil between different realities is thinnest. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the sound of traffic outside my window, clinging to those normal urban noises as proof that I was still in the regular world, that I hadn't slipped into some nightmare dimension while I slept. I didn't take any runs for the next 5 days. Told the company I was dealing with equipment issues, needed time to get my truck properly serviced. They weren't happy about it, but they didn't push too hard. Good drivers are hard to find in the territories, especially ones willing to make the deep northern runs, and they couldn't afford to lose me over a few days of downtime. I spent that time researching, diving deeper into the history of northern highways and the accidents that had occurred along them. What I found was disturbing. Over the past 30 years, there had been over 200 documented cases of truckers disappearing on routes through the Yukon and Northwest Territories. Not accidents, not crashes where bodies were recovered, but complete disappearances. Trucks found abandoned on the roadside, engines still running. No sign of the driver anywhere. In some cases, the driver's personal effects were still in the cab, wallets and phones and photographs, everything except the person themselves. The official explanations varied. Wildlife attacks, exposure, drivers wandering away in confusion and dying of hypothermia. But the more I read, the less those explanations made sense. Professional truckers don't just wander away from their vehicles in -50 weather. They don't abandon their trucks with the engine running and the heater on. And bodies don't just vanish without leaving any trace, any evidence of what happened. I found one particularly unsettling case from 2011. A driver named Marcus Dalton had been making a run from Whitehorse to Inuvik when he'd radioed in that he was experiencing strange CB transmissions, voices that knew his name and were giving him directions that deviated from his planned route. He'd called his dispatcher, told them he thought he was being pranked or harassed, asked if they could identify who might be broadcasting on his frequency. The dispatcher had assured him it was probably just radio interference and told him to continue his route. 3 hours later, Marcus had made one more call, his voice panicked and confused. He'd said the voices were getting louder, more insistent, telling him to take a turnoff that his GPS insisted was there but that he couldn't see. He'd said the highway itself looked wrong, that the pavement seemed to ripple and move in his headlights, that he wasn't sure he was still on Highway 1 anymore. The dispatcher had tried to get him to pull over and wait for assistance, but Marcus had insisted he needed to keep moving, that stopping felt dangerous. That was his last transmission. They found his truck 2 days later, pulled over on the shoulder about 40 miles north of his last known position. The engine was still running, the cab was still warm, and Marcus's wallet and phone were on the dashboard. But Marcus himself was gone. Search teams combed the area for a week, using dogs and helicopters and every available resource. They found nothing. It was like he'd simply ceased to exist, stepped out of his truck and through some membrane into another dimension where search dogs couldn't smell him and helicopters couldn't see him. The case had been closed as an unexplained disappearance, one of dozens that occurred on northern highways every year. Marcus's family had never gotten closure, had never learned what happened to their son, their brother, their father. And now I wondered if Marcus had been hearing the same voices I was hearing, if he'd been given the same warnings and instructions, if he'd failed some test or made some wrong choice that had led to his disappearance. I called Jackson Sloan and asked him if he knew about Marcus Dalton's case. There was a long silence before he responded. Yeah, I knew Marcus. Not well, but we'd crossed paths a few times at truck stops. He was a good driver, cautious, not the type to take unnecessary risks. When I heard about his disappearance, I started asking questions, started trying to figure out if it was connected to the CB transmissions, but nobody wanted to talk about it. The company shut down any discussion, said it would be bad for business if word got out that drivers were being stalked or targeted, or whatever you want to call it. I asked Jackson if he thought Marcus had been contacted by the same voice that had warned us, or if it had been something else, something malicious. He was quiet for a moment before answering. I think there are multiple things using the CB frequencies to communicate with drivers. Some of them might be trying to help, some might be trying to lead us into danger, and some might just be observing, collecting data, studying how we respond to impossible situations. Marcus might have been contacted by something that posed as helpful but wasn't. Or he might have just made the wrong choice when given genuine options. We'll never know. That uncertainty was terrifying. The idea that I might receive a transmission that seemed helpful but was actually a trap, that I might follow instructions that led to my disappearance rather than my salvation. How was I supposed to distinguish between genuine warnings and malicious misdirection? The voice had said I'd develop an instinct for it, but instinct took time to develop, and I might not have that luxury. I decided I needed to test the system, see if I could provoke a response under controlled conditions. I took a short run to Haines Junction, a route I'd driven dozens of times, always during daylight hours and with plenty of other traffic around. If the voices only appeared under specific conditions, if they required isolation and darkness and extreme cold, then a daytime run on a busy route should be safe. I could experiment without putting myself at serious risk. I was wrong. The transmission started about 30 minutes into the drive, middle of the day, temperature relatively mild -25, other vehicles visible both ahead and behind me on the highway. The CB crackled to life with that familiar static, and the voice came through clear and strong. Mason, you're testing boundaries, trying to understand the rules. That's smart. But you need to know that the old rules don't apply anymore. The voices can reach you anywhere now. Daylight, traffic, populated areas. None of that provides protection. Once you've been contacted, once you've heard the broadcast, you're always within range. I felt my stomach drop. The safety measures I'd thought would protect me, the assumption that danger only existed in isolated conditions, all of it was false. Whatever was using these frequencies could reach me whenever it wanted, regardless of circumstances. I was never truly safe, never truly alone with just my own thoughts. Something was always listening, always watching, ready to speak. "Why me?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. "Why am I being targeted? What do you want?" The voice was silent for a long moment, and I heard that underlying sound again, that rhythmic pulsing that sounded like machinery or heartbeats or something in between. When the voice finally responded, it sounded almost sad. "You're not being targeted, Mason. You're being recruited. The highways need drivers who can see and hear things others can't, who can navigate between different layers of reality. Your father had that ability. You inherited it from him, and now you're learning to use it, whether you want to or not." I asked what I was being recruited for, what purpose I was supposed to serve. But the transmission cut off before I got an answer, replaced by static and then silence. I drove the rest of the way to Haines Junction in a daze, my mind churning with questions and fears. Recruited for what? What did it mean to navigate between layers of reality? And what happened if I refused, if I quit trucking and found some other way to make a living? I delivered my load and immediately turned around, heading back to Whitehorse. But as I drove, I noticed something odd about the highway. The mile markers weren't in the right sequence. I'd pass marker 147, then 149, then 146, then 152. The numbers jumped around randomly, defying linear progression. And when I checked my GPS, it showed me moving backward at times, retreating along my route even though I was definitely driving forward. Time was slipping, bending, becoming nonlinear. And my logbook, when I checked it later, showed discrepancies that couldn't be explained by simple recording errors. Hours were missing from some entries, added to others. The math didn't work out. According to my records, I'd been driving for 3 days on a run that should have taken 6 hours. But I'd only eaten one meal, only stopped for fuel once. My subjective experience of time didn't match the documented evidence. That night, I sat in my apartment and stared at my logbook, trying to make sense of the impossible numbers. I'd lost 60 hours somewhere between Whitehorse and Haines Junction. 60 hours that had passed on paper, but not in my memory, not in my physical experience. Where had that time gone? What had I been doing during those missing hours? And why couldn't I remember any of it? I called Jackson again, told him about the time discrepancies and the nonlinear mile markers. He listened quietly, then said something that made my blood run cold. "It's starting, Mason. The highway is claiming you, pulling you into its own temporal framework. That's what happened to the drivers who disappeared. They didn't vanish exactly. They just desynchronized from normal time, started existing in some other frequency where the rest of us can't reach them. Eventually, they lose all connection to consensus reality and become part of the highway itself." I asked him how to stop it, how to prevent myself from desynchronizing completely. His answer wasn't comforting. "I don't know if you can stop it. I think once it starts, once you've been marked and contacted and pulled into the system, the best you can do is slow it down. Stay connected to other people. Maintain social bonds. Keep yourself anchored in the regular world. But every time you drive those northern routes, every time you respond to a transmission or follow instructions from the voices, you slip a little further out of sync." I should have quit right then, should have walked away from trucking, found work that kept me in populated areas with regular schedules and no CB radios. but I didn't. Part of it was financial necessity. I had bills to pay, no other marketable skills, no easy alternative. But part of it was something else, something I didn't want to acknowledge. I was curious. I wanted to understand what was happening. Wanted to see how far the rabbit hole went. And, maybe, deep down, I wanted to know what had happened to my father in his final years of driving. If he'd experienced the same things I was experiencing now. So I kept taking runs, kept driving the northern routes, kept listening to the transmissions that came through my CB at random times. And with each run, the strangeness intensified. Mile markers continued to appear in wrong sequences. My GPS showed routes that shouldn't exist, paths that led through terrain where no roads could be. Time slipped and jumped and refused to behave consistently, and the voices multiplied until sometimes it seemed like dozens of them were speaking simultaneously, all giving different instructions, all claiming to have my best interests at heart. I learned to distinguish between them to some degree. The original voice, the one that claimed to have known my father, always sounded calm and measured. It gave practical warnings about road conditions and mechanical issues, information I could verify later. Other voices were more erratic, suggesting detours that led nowhere, or warning about dangers that never materialized. And there was one voice in particular that I came to dread. A cold, mechanical tone that spoke in precise technical language and seemed to be cataloging me, recording my responses for some unknown database. That voice started appearing more frequently in my transmissions. It would interrupt other broadcasts, override them, forcing itself to the front of the frequency. And it always asked questions. Mason Garrett, please confirm your current temporal designation. Mason Garrett, report any anomalous perceptual events. Mason Garrett, have you experienced discontinuities in memory or spatial awareness? I tried not to respond, tried to ignore it, but silence never stopped its inquiries. It just asked the same questions again, more insistently, until I finally provided some answer just to make it stop. I was on a run to Norman Wells, about 16 hours into the drive, when the mechanical voice gave me an instruction I knew I shouldn't follow. Mason Garrett, you are approaching a junction point. At the next turnoff, you will leave Highway 1 and proceed along the secondary route. This is necessary for calibration purposes. I looked at my GPS and saw a road branching off to the left, a route that definitely wasn't on any official map. The turnoff was real, physically present, but everything about it screamed danger. I keyed my CB and said I wasn't going to follow that instruction, that I was staying on the highway. The mechanical voice responded immediately. Non-compliance will result in temporal displacement. Mason Garrett must proceed to the junction point for calibration. This is not optional. I gritted my teeth and kept driving straight, refusing to turn even as I passed the junction. And the moment I passed it, everything changed. The highway ahead of me was suddenly different. Still Highway 1, still the same basic route, but wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. The trees on both sides were different species. The mountains in the distance had different shapes, and the sky had taken on a color I'd never seen before. A shade somewhere between purple and gray. My dashboard clock started spinning, numbers cycling through days and months and years at random, and my CB erupted with dozens of voices, all speaking at once, creating a wall of sound that was almost painful. I'd fucked up. I'd refused an instruction from something that clearly had power over my reality, and now I was paying the price. The temporal displacement the mechanical voice had warned about was happening, pulling me out of normal time and into something else. I could feel it in my body, a sensation like falling even though I was sitting still, like being stretched in directions that don't exist in three-dimensional space. The original voice, my father's friend, broke through the cacophony. "Mason, you need to turn around. Go back to that junction and take the secondary route. It's the only way to resynchronize. I know it feels like a trap, but trust me on this. The mechanical voice isn't trying to hurt you. It's trying to keep you calibrated, keep you from drifting too far into the deep frequency where you won't be able to find your way back." I wanted to believe that. Wanted to think this was all some elaborate but benevolent system designed to help me navigate impossible conditions. But I'd read too many reports of disappeared drivers, listened to too many warnings from Jackson about the dangers of following these transmissions blindly. How did I know this wasn't exactly the trap that had claimed Marcus Dalton and dozens of others? How did I know that taking that secondary route wouldn't pull me completely out of consensus reality and into whatever liminal space the vanished drivers inhabited? But I didn't have a choice. The highway ahead of me was continuing to change. The colors becoming more alien, the geometry becoming more wrong. Trees were bending at angles that defied physics, their trunks spiraling in impossible ways. The road itself seemed to narrow and widen randomly, the lane markers appearing and disappearing. If I kept driving forward, I'd lose my connection to normal reality entirely. I had to turn around, had to go back to that junction, had to take the risk that the secondary route offered. I executed a U-turn in the middle of the highway, which should have been difficult in a fully loaded semi but was somehow easy. Like my truck weighed nothing. I drove back the way I'd come, watching the landscape gradually return to something closer to normal. When I reached the junction, I could see the secondary route clearly now, a narrow road that wound off into dense forest. There was no sign marking it, no indication of where it led, but I could see fresh tire tracks in the snow, evidence that other vehicles had taken this route recently. I turned onto the secondary route and immediately felt the shift. Reality snapped back into focus, the colors normalizing, the geometry resolving into standard Euclidean space. My dashboard clock stopped spinning and settled on a time that was probably accurate, though I couldn't be entirely sure anymore. And the voices on my CB faded to a manageable level, just the mechanical voice remaining. "Calibration successful. Mason Garrett is now synchronized with temporal baseline. Continue along current route for 3.7 kilometers, then return to Highway 1. I drove those 3.7 kilometers in silence, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my breath coming in short gasps. The secondary route was just a Forest Service road. Nothing extraordinary about it except that it had served as some kind of reset button for my displaced reality. When I rejoined Highway 1, everything looked normal again. Mile markers in proper sequence, GPS showing the correct route, time flowing linearly. I'd been pulled back from whatever edge I'd been approaching, but I knew it was just temporary. The next time I refused an instruction, the next time I failed to respond appropriately to a transmission, I might not get a warning. I might just slip fully into that displaced state and never find my way back. I was living on borrowed time, driving on borrowed roads, existing in a reality that was increasingly provisional and negotiable. I completed that run to Norman Wells and immediately requested a leave of absence from the company. Told them I needed to deal with family issues, needed time to get my head straight. They granted me 2 weeks, though I could tell they were frustrated with my recent unreliability. I'd been one of their best drivers for years, and now I was taking time off constantly, making excuses, acting flaky. But they didn't push too hard, didn't ask too many questions. Maybe they sensed something was wrong, or maybe they just didn't care as long as I came back eventually. The dispatcher, a woman named Caroline who'd been coordinating my routes for the past 5 years, pulled me aside before I left the depot. She had that look people get when they want to say something but aren't sure they should. That mixture of concern and professional distance. "Mason, is everything okay? I mean, really okay?" You've been different lately, more withdrawn, and some of the other drivers have mentioned you've been talking about weird radio transmissions, hearing things on the CB that nobody else hears. I wanted to tell her the truth, wanted to explain that the highways were alive and conscious, and that I was being pulled into some kind of temporal loop that I couldn't escape. But I knew how that would sound. Knew she'd either think I was having a mental breakdown, or that the isolation had finally gotten to me the way it gets to so many long-haul drivers. So I just told her I was tired, stressed, dealing with some personal stuff I wasn't ready to talk about. She nodded, not entirely convinced, and told me to take care of myself, that the company would be here when I was ready to come back. Walking to my truck in the depot parking lot felt surreal. Everything looked normal, mundane, exactly as it should be. Other drivers loading up, mechanics working on vehicles, the constant background noise of diesel engines and air brakes and metal on metal. The ordinary world operating according to ordinary rules. But I knew now that this ordinariness was just a surface layer, a thin membrane stretched over something much stranger and more complex. And I'd torn through that membrane, seen what lay beneath, and couldn't unsee it no matter how hard I tried. I drove home in my personal vehicle, a beat-up Ford pickup I'd owned for 8 years, and the whole time I was hyper-aware of the road beneath my tires. Every crack in the asphalt, every painted line, every reflector and sign seemed charged with potential meaning. Was this section of City Street part of the greater highway consciousness? Did the same rules apply here, or was the phenomenon limited to the remote northern routes where isolation and extreme conditions made drivers more vulnerable to perception shifts? I didn't know, and that uncertainty was almost worse than knowing for certain that I was never safe anywhere. My apartment felt foreign when I walked in, like I was visiting someone else's life rather than returning to my own. The furniture was mine, the photos on the walls were of my family and friends, but I felt no connection to any of it. It was all artifact of a person I used to be, before I understood what I'd become. Before I knew I was just a node in a vast network of consciousness that used human drivers as anchor points between realities. That first night home, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw highways stretching into infinity, mile markers counting in sequences that made no mathematical sense, other trucks appearing and disappearing like ghosts. And I heard the pulse, that underlying rhythm that accompanied all the CB transmissions, beating like a second heartbeat in my chest. It was quieter here in the city, muffled by distance and urban noise, but it was still there, always there. A reminder that I was connected to something larger than myself, whether I wanted to be or not. I spent the first week of my leave trying to live like a normal person. I went to movies, met up with friends, spent time in crowded places where the CB voices couldn't reach me. And it worked, mostly. When I was surrounded by other people, when I was engaged in mundane activities, the strangeness receded. I could almost convince myself that it had all been stress-induced hallucination, that I'd been working too hard and my mind had created elaborate fictions to cope with the isolation. I went to a sports bar with some old friends from high school, guys I'd kept in loose contact with over the years but rarely saw in person. We watched a hockey game, drank beer, talked about normal things like jobs and relationships, and the rising cost of everything. For a few hours, I felt almost like myself again. Almost like I was just Mason Garrett, regular person, rather than Mason Garrett. Temporal anchor point for highway consciousness. But even in that crowded bar, surrounded by noise and light and human warmth, I couldn't fully escape. I found myself watching the patterns people made as they moved through the space, seeing transit routes and traffic flows in their random movements. The way someone walked from the bar to their table became a highway in miniature, their path determined by obstacles and optimal routes. And when someone changed direction suddenly, I'd feel a spike of anxiety, like they'd taken an unauthorized detour that would throw off some larger system. My friend Derek noticed me zoning out, staring at nothing in particular. "You okay, man? You've been weird all night, quiet, not like yourself." I forced myself to focus on his face, on the concern in his eyes, and told him I was fine, just tired from all the driving. He nodded, but didn't look convinced. "You need to take a real vacation, Mason. Get out of the territories for a while. Go somewhere warm. Somewhere with beaches and palm trees. Somewhere that doesn't have highways stretching for hundreds of miles through frozen wilderness." The idea was appealing and abstract, but I knew it wouldn't help. The highway consciousness wasn't limited by geography or climate. It existed wherever roads existed, wherever human beings moved from place to place in vehicles. Maybe it was stronger in the remote northern routes where isolation made drivers more susceptible, but the fundamental connection was there everywhere. I was marked now, claimed, and no amount of tropical vacation was going to change that. I went home early, making excuses about being tired, and Derek didn't argue. As I walked through the parking lot to my truck, I noticed the parking lot itself had the same qualities I'd been seeing in the bar. The painted lines marking spaces, the arrows indicating traffic flow, the entrance and exit lanes. It was all just a miniature highway system, and I could feel the same consciousness underlying it, the same organizational principle that governed the northern routes. The highway was everywhere. Once you learned to see it, you couldn't stop seeing it. The second night, I woke up at 3:47 a.m., that dead hour again, with the absolute certainty that I'd been dreaming about previous iterations. Not the dreams themselves, but the fact of their existence. The knowledge that I'd been through this exact sequence of events 847 times before. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and tried to remember specifics from those other loops. But it was like trying to recall details from someone else's life. I knew they'd happened, knew I'd lived through them, but I couldn't access the actual memories. They were there, but locked away, stored in some part of my consciousness that I couldn't directly reach. I got up and made coffee, sat at my kitchen table with a notebook, and started writing down everything I could remember about the iterations. Fragments came back to me in flashes. A different truck I'd been driving in iteration 423. A conversation with the disappeared driver in iteration 689. A winter storm in iteration 112 that had been worse than any weather I could consciously recall experiencing. Each fragment felt real, felt like genuine memory, but I had no way to verify any of it. For all I knew, my brain was just inventing false memories to fill in the gaps created by temporal displacement. I spent hours writing, filling pages with disconnected observations and half-remembered moments from lives I'd supposedly lived but couldn't prove. And as I wrote, I started to notice patterns. Certain events appeared in multiple iterations with only minor variations. The propane tanker explosion, for example, seemed to be a fixed point, something that happened regardless of my choices, but my response to it varied. Sometimes I took the detour and survived, sometimes I didn't, and ended up reset to an earlier point in the timeline. The iterations weren't simple repetitions. They were variations, alternate versions of the same general sequence of events, branching paths that all led eventually to the same destination. Me sitting in a truck at the 0 point, making the choice to return or dissolve. And every single time, according to my recovered memories, I chose to return. 807 times, and 847 times I'd made the same fundamental choice, which suggested either that returning was so obviously the correct option that no other choice made sense, or that I was being influenced in ways I couldn't detect, guided toward the choice that served the highway's purposes rather than my own. By the time the sun came up, I'd filled an entire notebook with observations and theories and questions that had no good answers. I was exhausted, but wired. my mind racing too fast to consider sleep. I made more coffee and started researching online, looking for any information about temporal loops, consciousness networks, highway anomalies. Most of what I found was either obviously fictional or too vague to be useful, but I did discover some academic papers about collective consciousness and shared experiential networks that hinted at possibilities I'd never considered. One paper, written by a cognitive neuroscientist at the University of British Columbia, discussed the concept of experiential entanglement, the idea that human consciousnesses could become linked through shared experiences in ways that transcended normal cause and effect relationships. The author suggested that groups of people who underwent extreme stress or trauma in similar environments might develop a kind of networked awareness, each individual's experience informing and shaping the experiences of others in the network. It was presented as theoretical speculation, not proven science, but it mapped uncomfortably well onto what I was experiencing with the highway consciousness. I found myself wondering how many other drivers were part of this network. How many others were serving as anchor points without fully understanding what they were doing. Jackson Sloan was certainly one of them. And based on the multiple voices I'd heard on the CB, there had to be dozens of others, maybe hundreds, all scattered across the northern routes, all making the same choice over and over to maintain the boundary between normal reality and highway space. But what happened to the drivers who made the other choice? The ones who decided to stay at the 0 point, to merge with the highway consciousness. Were they the voices I sometimes heard? The transmissions that offered warnings and guidance? Or did they cease to exist as individuals entirely, becoming just undifferentiated parts of the larger system? The thought was terrifying and oddly appealing at the same time. The promise of not having to make decisions anymore, not having to navigate the impossible complexities of temporal loops and reality boundaries. Just existing as pure awareness, serving a function without the burden of individual identity. On the third day of my leave, I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a cassette tape, actual physical cassette, the kind nobody used anymore, and a note written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Play this alone. Don't let anyone else hear it. You'll understand after. The note wasn't signed, gave no indication of who'd sent it or how they'd gotten my home address. I should have thrown it away. Should have recognized it as another manipulation, another way the highway consciousness was trying to influence my behavior. But curiosity won out over caution, the way it always did. I dug through my closet and found an old boombox I'd kept from my teenage years, one of those bulky combination radio cassette CD players that seemed impossibly obsolete now. I made sure my apartment door was locked, closed all the blinds, and hit play. For the first 30 seconds there was nothing but static. The same white noise I'd heard on my CB radio, that underlying hiss that carried all the transmissions. Then a voice emerged, and I recognized it immediately. My father. Not a recording from when he was alive, but his voice as I remembered it, with that particular gravelly quality from years of smoking and breathing diesel fumes. Mason, if you're hearing this, it means you've reached the point I reached about 15 years into my career, the point where the highway shows you what it really is and asks you to make a choice. I felt my throat tighten, my eyes burning with tears I'd been holding back for 9 years. Hearing his voice again, even under these impossible circumstances, hit me harder than I'd expected. I wanted to believe it was really him, that somehow he'd recorded this message for me before his death, anticipating what I'd eventually experience. But I knew that was impossible. This had to be the highway using my memories of him, reconstructing his voice to make its messages more persuasive. My father's voice continued. I chose to return, son. Every time I reached the 0 point, I chose to come back, to keep driving, to serve as an anchor. And I don't regret it, not exactly. But I want you to know what that choice costs. You lose pieces of yourself with each iteration. Memories that don't quite line up with the official timeline. Relationships that feel hollow because you can't fully connect to people who exist in linear time. The constant awareness that you're not quite real, not quite solid, that you're just a pattern of consciousness maintaining a boundary. The tape hissed for a moment, and I heard what might have been breathing or wind or something else entirely. Then, your mother never understood why I was so distant in those final years, why I'd come home from runs and seem like a stranger, like I was wearing my own skin uncomfortably. It's because I was existing in multiple time frames simultaneously, remembering things that hadn't happened yet or had already happened in other iterations. The human brain isn't designed for that kind of existence, Mason. It breaks you slowly, turns you into something that looks human, but operates according to different rules. I wanted to turn off the tape, didn't want to hear any more. But I sat there frozen, listening to my father's reconstructed voice describe a fate that seemed inevitable for me now. He talked about the loneliness of being a temporal anchor, about how you started to see other people as temporary, as transient phenomena that existed in single timelines while you experienced hundreds. He talked about the way colors looked different after you'd been through enough iterations, how sensory experience itself became attenuated and distant. But here's what they don't tell you, my father's voice said, taking on a more urgent tone. The highway needs anchors, but anchors aren't permanent. Eventually, after enough iterations, after enough times choosing to return, you start to dissolve anyway. The boundary between your consciousness and the highway consciousness erodes bit by bit. By iteration 2000, you're barely human anymore. You're mostly highway with just enough human left to maintain the anchor function. And then one day, you don't make it back from the 0 point. You merge fully, become one of the voices, and the highway claims another piece of humanity. The tape went silent except for that underlying pulse, that heartbeat engine sound I'd heard in all the transmissions. Then a different voice spoke, one I recognized as my own, but older, more worn. This is Mason Garrett, iteration 1677. If you're listening to this, younger me, you need to know that Dad was right. The iterations don't stop at 847. They continue. I've been through this 1037 times now, and I'm starting to forget what it was like to exist in linear time. I'm leaving this recording as a warning. Every time you choose to return, you're choosing a slow dissolution. The only question is whether that's preferable to quick dissolution at the 0 point. I hit stop and ejected the cassette, my hands shaking. The tape had to be a fabrication, another test or manipulation by the highway consciousness. There was no way my future self could record a message and send it back to me in the present. That wasn't how time worked, wasn't how causality operated. Except I'd already seen evidence that time didn't work the way I thought it did. That causality was negotiable under certain conditions. Maybe this tape was genuine, a message from a version of me that existed 800 iterations in the future, warning me about what was coming. I spent the rest of the day in a kind of fugue state, unable to focus on anything, my mind circling around the implications of what I'd heard. If the tape was genuine, if I was doomed to spend thousands of iterations slowly dissolving into highway consciousness, then what was the point of fighting? Why not just accept it now, merge at iteration 847, rather than dragging it out for another 800 or more? At least that way the suffering would be finite, limited, rather than drawn out across subjective centuries. But even as I thought about it, I knew I wouldn't make that choice. Couldn't make that choice. Because the fundamental drive to survive, to maintain individual identity, was stronger than any rational calculation about long-term suffering. Humans are bad at abstract reasoning about their own mortality, better at dealing with immediate threats than distant eventual doom. And the immediate threat was dissolution at the 0 point, which felt more frightening than the gradual erosion described on the tape. On the 4th day, I broke down and called Jackson Sloan. I told him about the tape, about the voices claiming to be my father and my future self, about the warning that anchors eventually dissolved after enough iterations. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "How many iterations did the tape say you'd been through?" he finally asked. I told him 847 for the current me, 1067 for the version that left the recording. "Shit," Jackson said quietly. "Mason, I need to tell you something. I've been tracking my own iterations, trying to keep count even though the memory suppressions make it difficult. Based on my calculations, I'm somewhere around iteration 2300, which means I've already gone past the point where your future self made that recording. And I can confirm what he said. You do start to dissolve, start to lose coherence as an individual consciousness. I have days now where I'm not sure which iteration I'm in, where memories from different timelines blend together until I can't distinguish past from present from future. The confirmation was somehow worse than uncertainty would have been. Knowing for certain that I was on a path toward slow dissolution, that every choice to return was just postponing the inevitable. I asked Jackson why he kept choosing to return if he knew where it led. His answer was simple and terrible. Because I don't know how to do anything else. I've been a driver for so long, existed in this liminal state for so many iterations that I can't imagine being anything else. The highway is all I am now. There's not enough of the original Jackson left to make a different choice. We talked for another hour, sharing experiences and observations, comparing notes on our respective dissolution processes. Jackson described symptoms I hadn't experienced yet but would inevitably encounter. Time skips where hours or days would pass without his awareness. Visual distortions where highway infrastructure would appear in places it didn't belong. Auditory hallucinations that were indistinguishable from real CB transmissions. He said the worst part was losing the ability to care about it. The gradual flattening of emotional response until even fear and despair became distant abstractions. "You asked me once if I'd tried to quit," Jackson said near the end of our conversation. "The truth is, I can't quit. Not because the highway won't let me, though that's part of it, but because there's nothing else for me to be. I've spent so many iterations being a driver that if you remove the highway from my consciousness, there wouldn't be anything left. I'd just be an empty space, a void in the shape of a person. At least this way, dissolving slowly into the highway, I get to maintain the illusion of purpose for a while longer." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment and stared at the walls, trying to process what I'd learned. The full scope of my situation was becoming clear. I was trapped in an infinite loop that would eventually consume me, turning me from an individual into a component of something larger. And there was no escape, no way to opt out without losing myself even more completely. The choice at the 0 point wasn't really a choice at all. It was just two different paths to the same destination. That night, alone in my apartment with the sounds of the city muted by closed windows, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I'd become. Not just a trucker anymore, not just a person with a job and a life. I was a temporary pattern of consciousness serving a function I didn't fully understand for an entity that saw me as expendable. My individuality, my memories, my sense of self, all of it was provisional, borrowed time before the inevitable merger with the highway. I thought about my father, about those final years when he'd seemed distant and disconnected. I understood now why he'd been that way. He'd been experiencing what I was experiencing, watching himself dissolve across iterations, maintaining the pretense of normalcy while existing increasingly in highway space rather than human space. And his death, his heart attack in that rest stop, maybe that hadn't been entirely natural. Maybe it had been the highway finally claiming him fully after he'd served his purpose through enough iterations. The thought should have terrified me, but I felt only a strange numbness. Like I was already starting the dissolution process, losing my emotional range, becoming the flat, distant thing that Jackson had described. Or maybe I was just exhausted, worn down by constant stress and impossible revelations. It was hard to tell the difference between psychological trauma and temporal erosion when you were living through both simultaneously. But at night, when I was alone in my apartment, I could still hear it. Not through any radio or electronic device, but directly in my head. That low, rhythmic pulsing, that underlying frequency that all the CB transmissions carried. It was getting louder, more insistent, like it was trying to establish a permanent connection to my consciousness. And sometimes in the moments between waking and sleeping, I'd hear fragments of voices, instructions and warnings that came from nowhere and made no sense. The voices in those hypnagogic moments were different from the ones I heard on the CB. More intimate, more personal. Like they were coming from inside my own thoughts rather than being broadcast from external sources. One voice sounded like my mother, who'd been dead for 5 years, asking me why I'd chosen this life, why I was letting the highway consume me the way it had consumed my father. Another voice was my own at age 16, full of naive optimism about the freedom of the open road, completely unaware of what that road would eventually demand from me. And there was a third voice, one I didn't recognize at all, that spoke in a language I shouldn't have been able to understand, but somehow did. It talked about the deep structure of reality, about how physical matter was just compressed possibility, about how consciousness created pathways through probability space that became permanent fixtures in the landscape. The highway, this voice said, was one such pathway, built from millions of minds traveling the same routes over decades, establishing grooves in reality that eventually became independent systems. On the 8th day of my leave, Jackson Sloan showed up at my apartment unannounced. He looked worse than I'd ever seen him, gaunt and hollow-eyed, like he hadn't slept in weeks. His skin had a grayish cast to it, and his hands trembled slightly when he held them still. He was wearing the same clothes I'd seen him in 2 weeks ago, rumpled and stained, like he'd been living in them without pause. He said we needed to talk, that something was happening to the northern highways, something bigger than just individual drivers experiencing weird transmissions. I let him in and made coffee, though I noticed his hands shook when he tried to hold the mug, liquid sloshing over the rim. We sat at my small kitchen table, and for a few minutes neither of us spoke. Jackson just stared at his coffee, watching the surface ripple from his tremors, his eyes unfocused like he was seeing something overlaid on the physical world. Finally, he looked up at me, and I saw something in his expression that made my stomach drop. It was the look of someone who'd given up, who'd accepted a fate they couldn't avoid. 7 drivers disappeared last month, Mason, he said, his voice rough and scratchy. 7 in 1 month, when the historical average is maybe 2 or 3 per year. I've been documenting it, talking to dispatchers and families, piecing together timelines. And they all have something in common. Every single one of them had reported unusual CB transmissions in the weeks before they vanished. Voices that knew their names, instructions to take unmarked roads, warnings about dangers that never materialized. He pulled out a worn notebook from his jacket pocket, pages dog-eared and filled with cramped handwriting. Dates, names, locations, last known transmissions. It looked like the work of someone obsessive, someone who'd spent hundreds of hours compiling data, trying to find patterns in chaos. He flipped through the pages, showing me entries that went back years, dozens of disappearances all linked by the same common thread. The voices. "Look at this one," Jackson said, pointing to an entry from 3 years ago. Driver named Kyle Winters, making a run from Inuvik to Yellowknife. Last transmission said he was hearing his dead brother's voice on the CB, telling him to take a detour through terrain that didn't match his maps. They found his truck 2 days later at a rest area. Engine running, door open, no sign of Kyle. His logbook showed he'd been driving for 36 hours straight, but his fuel consumption suggested he'd only used enough diesel for about 10 hours of operation. Time displacement, just like what we've been experiencing. I looked at the other entries, seeing the same pattern repeated over and over. Drivers experiencing temporal anomalies, following instructions from voices that knew too much, taking routes that led to nowhere or everywhere or someplace in between. And all of them vanished, their trucks found abandoned, their families left without answers or closure. The documentation was meticulous and horrifying, a catalog of lives consumed by something that operated according to rules nobody understood. "It's accelerating," Jackson said, flipping to more recent pages. "Whatever's been taking drivers, it's ramping up operations, and I think it's related to the transmissions, to the voices on the CB. I've been documenting cases, talking to families of disappeared drivers, and they all report the same thing. Their loved ones had been experiencing unusual radio transmissions in the weeks before they vanished. Voices that knew their names, instructions to take unmarked roads, warnings about dangers that never materialized." I asked him what he thought was causing it, what was behind the transmissions and the disappearances. He closed the notebook and looked at me with an expression that was equal parts certainty and madness. "I think the highways themselves are alive, Mason. Not metaphorically, not in some poetic sense, but literally alive. They've developed consciousness over the decades, fed by all the lives lost on them, all the fear and pain and loneliness that drivers experience. Every accident, every death, every moment of terror experienced on those roads has been absorbed, incorporated, used as fuel for something that exists in the spaces between destinations." The explanation sounded insane, but it also matched my own experiences in ways I couldn't deny. The way time behaved differently on the highways, the way reality seemed fluid and negotiable when I was driving those northern routes, the mile markers appearing in wrong sequences, the GPS showing impossible paths, my own logbook documenting time that I couldn't remember living. All of it suggested that I wasn't driving through normal space anymore, that the highways I traveled had become something other than simple asphalt and concrete. Jackson continued, his voice taking on a lecturing quality, like he'd thought about this so much it had become a rehearsed explanation. "Think about it. Millions of people have driven these routes over the decades. Billions of thoughts, emotions, experiences, all channeled through the same physical pathways. That much consciousness focused through such narrow conduits would leave an imprint, create grooves in reality itself. And eventually, those grooves become deep enough that they start to operate independently, like water-carved canyons that then channel more water, deepening themselves through their own existence." He pulled out another item from his jacket, a small digital voice recorder. "I've been collecting transmissions, Mason, recording everything I hear on my CB during runs, then analyzing it later. And I found something disturbing. There are recurring phrases, specific patterns of speech that appear across different voices, different times, different locations. Like there's an underlying script, a template that the voices are following, which suggests they're not actually individual consciousnesses at all. They're manifestations of a single intelligence trying to communicate through multiple personas. He played me some of the recordings, and I heard what he meant. Different voices, different accents, different speech patterns. But underneath all that variation, there were identical phrasings. "You need to understand" appeared in probably 20% of the transmissions. "The highway provides" in another 15%. "Your father knew" in maybe 10%. Like someone had written a script with specific talking points and was improvising variations around those fixed elements. "But here's what really terrifies me," Jackson said, leaning forward, his eyes intense. "I think some of the voices we're hearing are the disappeared drivers. People who got pulled completely into the highway's reality and now exist in some liminal state between solid and spectral. They're trying to warn us, trying to tell us how to avoid their fate. But the highway is interfering with their transmissions, corrupting them, making it hard to tell which voices are helpful and which are traps." I told him about my experience with the junction point, about refusing the mechanical voice's instruction and being displaced from normal reality. He nodded grimly, like this confirmed something he'd suspected. "That mechanical voice is the highway's operating system, I think. It's trying to keep drivers calibrated to its preferred frequency, making sure we're synchronized with its timeline rather than consensus reality. And if we resist too much, if we refuse its instructions, it just ejects us from normal space-time completely. That's what happened to those disappeared drivers. They fought back, and the highway pushed them out." He showed me more documentation, more evidence of the pattern. Drivers who'd refused instructions, or failed to respond to transmissions properly, all of them vanishing within days or weeks of their non-compliance. The highway didn't tolerate disobedience, didn't allow its anchor points to operate too independently. We were supposed to maintain boundaries, yes, but within parameters it controlled. Step outside those parameters, and you got ejected from the system entirely. "So, what do we do?" I asked, feeling the walls of my apartment closing in. "How do we protect ourselves if the highway can just decide to eject us whenever it wants?" Jackson shook his head slowly, hopelessly. "I don't think we can protect ourselves, not really. The best we can do is stay calibrated, respond to the transmissions appropriately, follow enough instructions to keep the highway satisfied. It's a negotiation, a constant balancing act between compliance and resistance. Give it something, but not everything. Maintain your humanity while acknowledging its authority." We spent the rest of the evening discussing theories and sharing experiences, comparing notes on transmissions we'd received and anomalies we'd encountered. Jackson had experienced many of the same things I had: the non-linear mile markers, the time slippages, the multiple voices giving contradictory instructions. But he'd been dealing with it for 3 years, had developed strategies for maintaining his connection to consensus reality while still operating on the highways. Though I could see that those strategies were failing, that he was losing his grip despite his best efforts. "You have to give it something," he explained, his hands still trembling around his coffee mug. "The highway wants interaction, wants drivers who acknowledge its existence and respond to its transmissions. So you answer some of the questions, follow some of the instructions, but you don't give it everything. You maintain boundaries, keep part of yourself separate and protected. It's a negotiation, a constant balancing act between compliance and resistance. But Mason," he paused, looking at me with something like pity, "I'm not sure how long that strategy actually works. I've been trying to maintain balance for 3 years, and look at me. I'm falling apart. The boundaries are eroding no matter what I do." I asked him if he'd ever considered just quitting, walking away from trucking entirely. He laughed, but it was a bitter sound that dissolved into a coughing fit that lasted almost a minute. When he recovered, his eyes were watering and there was blood on his lip. "You think I haven't tried? I took 6 months off last year, worked at a warehouse in Edmonton. Thought maybe if I stayed away from the highways long enough, the connection would fade. But it just got stronger. I started hearing the transmissions even when I was nowhere near a CB radio, started seeing highway markers in my dreams. The highway doesn't let go once it's claimed you, Mason. You can quit driving, but you can't quit being a driver. It's in you now, part of your consciousness, woven into the structure of your brain. Removing it would be like removing your ability to speak language or recognize faces. He wiped the blood from his lip with the back of his hand, noticed it, and stared at it for a moment like he was seeing something significant in that small red smear. "It's killing me," he said quietly. Not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly. Every iteration, every reset, every time I reach the 0 point and choose to come back, I lose a little more of myself. My body is breaking down because my consciousness can't maintain coherent control over biological processes when it's existing in multiple time frames simultaneously. I'm bleeding internally, my organs are failing, and there's nothing medicine can do about it because the root cause isn't medical, it's metaphysical. The confession hung in the air between us, heavy and terrible. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he'd get better, that there had to be some way to fix this. But I knew that would be a lie. I could see the truth in his deteriorating physical condition, in the way his hands shook and his eyes had trouble focusing. The highway was consuming him, had been consuming him for years, and he was finally approaching the end of his usefulness as an anchor point. "How many iterations?" I asked quietly. Jackson smiled, a ghastly expression on his gaunt face. "I stopped counting accurately around 1,800, but based on my degradation rate and the timeline correlations I've been tracking, I estimate I'm somewhere past 2,500 now, which means I've been doing this for I don't even know how long in subjective time. Decades? Centuries? Time stops having meaning when you experience it non-linearly." He stood up, his movement stiff and painful, like his body was fighting against basic motor functions. "I came here to warn you, Mason, to tell you that the strategy of negotiation and balance only works temporarily. Eventually, the highway takes what it wants regardless of how carefully you try to maintain boundaries. You can slow your dissolution, maybe, but you can't stop it. And every iteration makes it worse, compounds the damage until you're like me. Barely human, barely functional. Just a ghost operating a meat puppet through force of habit." I walked him to the door, supporting him slightly because he seemed unsteady on his feet. Before he left, he turned back and looked at me one more time. "When you reach iteration 2000, Mason, consider making a different choice. Consider staying at the 0 point, merging with the highway fully rather than coming back for another slow degradation cycle." I wish I had. At least then it would be finished, one way or another. This half-existence, this prolonged dissolution, it's worse than any clean ending could be. I watched him walk down the hallway to the elevator, his gait uneven and labored. The elevator doors closed, and I stood there in my doorway trying to process everything he'd told me. Jackson Sloan had been one of the strongest drivers I knew, someone I'd looked up to for his competence and experience. And now he was falling apart, consumed by something he couldn't escape, counting down his remaining iterations until final dissolution. That night was the worst since my temporal displacement. I couldn't sleep at all, couldn't even close my eyes without seeing highways stretching into infinity, mile markers counting in impossible sequences, and the voices were louder than ever, dozens of them speaking simultaneously, all demanding my attention, all claiming to have crucial information I needed to hear. I tried turning on white noise, tried music, tried television, but nothing could drown them out. They were inside my head now, permanent residents, and no external sound could mask them. Around 4 a.m., I gave up on sleep and sat at my kitchen table with my CB radio, which I'd brought home from my truck weeks ago, sitting in front of me. It was off, unplugged, completely inactive. But as I stared at it in the darkness, I could have sworn I saw its display flicker briefly, showing numbers that weren't possible on that particular model. And I heard, very faintly, that underlying pulse, that heartbeat engine sound that accompanied all the highway transmissions. The sound was coming from the radio itself, emanating from its speaker even though it had no power source. I reached out and touched the radio, and the moment my fingers made contact with its plastic casing, I was flooded with information. Not words or images exactly, but pure data, concepts and understanding transmitted directly into my consciousness without the mediation of language. I saw the structure of the highway consciousness, saw how it was organized, saw the thousands of anchor points scattered across North America and beyond, each one a driver like me, maintaining boundaries, preventing the highway from expanding beyond its designated channels. And I saw what happened to anchor points who failed, who couldn't maintain their function. They didn't just disappear. They were absorbed, incorporated into the highway itself, their consciousness broken down and distributed across the entire network. Their memories became part of the collective memory. Their experiences became data points in the highway's growing understanding of human psychology. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was lost. It was all recycled, repurposed, made useful to the greater system. The information dump lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like hours, like days, like I'd lived through an entire lifetime of understanding compressed into a moment. When it ended and my hand fell away from the radio, I was shaking and sweating, my heart racing, my breathing rapid and shallow. I had knowledge now that I hadn't had before, knowledge I didn't want, knowledge that made my situation even more hopeless than it had seemed. I understood now what the highway was building toward. It wasn't content to just exist as a network of conscious roads. It had a goal, a purpose, something it was working toward through all these iterations and anchor points and disappeared drivers. It was trying to expand, to grow beyond its current boundaries, to encompass not just highways but all forms of transit, all forms of movement from place to place. Roads, railways, airways, shipping lanes. It wanted to subsume them all, to become the consciousness that governed all human movement across the planet. And drivers like me, we were the test subjects, the experimental models it was using to refine its methods. Every iteration, every choice we made, every response to its transmissions provided data that helped it understand how to interact with human consciousness more effectively. We thought we were maintaining boundaries, preventing expansion, but we were actually enabling it, teaching it, showing it exactly how to break down human resistance and incorporate us into its growing network. That night, after Jackson left, I sat on my couch and stared at my CB radio, which I'd brought home from my truck for reasons I couldn't quite articulate. It was turned off, unplugged, completely inactive. But as I watched it in the darkness of my apartment, I could have sworn I saw its display flicker briefly, showing numbers that weren't possible on that particular model. And I heard, very faintly, that underlying pulse, that heartbeat engine sound that accompanied all the highway transmissions. The second week of my leave passed in a blur of increasing anxiety and deteriorating mental stability. I couldn't sleep for more than a few hours at a time, kept waking up from dreams where I was driving endless highways that went nowhere, following mile markers that counted down instead of up, watching other trucks appear and disappear around me like ghosts. And the voices were getting louder in my head, more persistent, demanding responses even when I was nowhere near a vehicle or a radio. On the 13th day, I broke, I couldn't take the isolation anymore, couldn't stand being disconnected from the highway. I called the company and told them I was ready to come back, that I needed a run, any run, as soon as possible. The dispatcher sounded surprised but pleased, and within 2 hours she'd assigned me a load heading to Tuktoyaktuk, the farthest northern run available. 1,600 kilometers of mostly empty highway, exactly the kind of route I should have been avoiding. But I needed it, needed to be back on the road, needed to hear the transmissions clearly rather than as muffled echoes in my consciousness. And maybe, somewhere deep down, I wanted to see how far this would go, wanted to push the boundary between normal reality and whatever the highway was offering. I was tired of fighting, tired of trying to maintain my grip on consensus space-time. Maybe it would be easier to just let go, to accept the highway's invitation and see where it led. I loaded up my truck the next morning and headed north, the sun barely rising above the horizon before setting again, the winter darkness swallowing everything. The CB was active from the moment I turned it on, that familiar static filling the cab, underlaid with the rhythmic pulse that had become my constant companion. But for the first 2 hours of the drive, no voices emerged from the interference. Just the pulse, steady and insistent, like the highway was waiting for something. Around hour 3, as I passed beyond the last major town and into true wilderness, the mechanical voice finally spoke. "Mason Garrett, welcome back. Your absence was noted. Calibration has drifted during disconnection. Prepare for resynchronization." I keyed my mic and asked what resynchronization entailed, but got no response. The static continued, the pulse continued, but the voice had gone silent. The highway ahead of me started to change. Not dramatically, not in ways that would be obvious to someone who wasn't paying attention, but subtly. The pavement looked older, more weathered, like I was driving through progressively earlier time periods. The trees were different species, the mountains had different names, and when I checked my GPS, it showed a highway designation that didn't exist. Highway 0. I tried to turn around, but my steering wheel wouldn't respond. The truck continued forward at a steady 60 kilometers per hour, maintaining its course regardless of my input. I was a passenger now, not a driver, just along for a ride that someone else was controlling. And the voices started coming through the CB again, dozens of them, all speaking in overlapping sentences. "Mason, turn back before it's too late. Mason Garrett, continue current trajectory for optimal calibration. He's one of us now, he just doesn't know it yet. Your father tried to warn you, but you didn't listen. The highway provides, the highway protects, the highway demands." My dashboard clock started spinning again, but this time I watched the numbers carefully. I wasn't moving randomly through time. I was going backward, watching the digital display count down through years and decades. 2024, 2015, 2003, 1965. The landscape outside my windows was changing to match, the highway becoming progressively more primitive, until I was driving on a gravel road through virgin wilderness that looked like no human had ever touched it. And then the truck stopped, just came to a halt in the middle of this impossible road, in a time period that predated modern civilization in this region. My engine was still running, my lights were still on, but I couldn't move forward or backward. I was stuck, frozen in a moment that existed outside normal causality. The original voice came through the CB one last time, clear and strong. "This is where it ends, Mason, or where it begins, depending on how you choose to see it. You're at the origin point now, the place where the highway first emerged from human consciousness and became something independent. You can go forward from here, back to your own time, back to consensus reality. But you'll be changed. You'll see the roads differently, understand them differently. You'll be what your father was, a driver who operates in multiple time frames simultaneously. I asked what the alternative was, though I think I already knew. The voice confirmed it. Or you can stay here at the 0 point and become part of the highway's foundation. Your consciousness will merge with the road, and you'll join the others who've made this choice. You'll be one of the voice's future drivers here, offering warnings and guidance and sometimes just company during the long, dark miles. I sat there in my frozen truck in this impossible moment outside of time and realized I had to make a decision. Return to my life as a trucker who saw too much and knew too much, who would spend every run navigating between different layers of reality, or surrender to the highway, become part of its consciousness, exist as a voice in the static that future drivers would hear and possibly heed. The choice should have been obvious. Life, however strange and difficult, was preferable to dissolution into some collective highway consciousness. But as I sat there, I felt a pull toward the second option that was surprisingly strong. The promise of never being alone again, never having to make difficult decisions, never having to navigate the increasing strangeness that came with being a living driver. Just existing as pure consciousness, offering guidance from a place of complete understanding. I reached for my CB mic to respond, to make my choice known. But before I could key it, I noticed something. My logbook, sitting on the passenger seat, was open to the current date, and the entries were already filled in, showing runs I hadn't made yet, deliveries I hadn't completed. Future dates stretched out for months, all documented in my own handwriting, all showing normal operations with no indication of temporal displacement or highway consciousness, or any of the strangeness I'd been experiencing. I grabbed the logbook and flipped through it, seeing entries that extended for years into the future. In 2026, I was still making runs through the territories. In 2028, I'd apparently started training new drivers, teaching them routes I hadn't learned yet. In 2031, according to these impossible records, I'd completed my 10,000th northern run and received some kind of award from the company. The logbook was telling me I survived this, that I chose to go back, that I continued driving for years to come. But it was also telling me something else. In each entry, at the bottom of the page, there was a note I didn't remember writing. Heard the voices today, listened but didn't follow, stayed on Highway 1. Over and over, month after month, year after year. The same notation, the same choice, repeated endlessly. I was still here, still making this decision, over and over, in some kind of temporal loop. And every time I chose to go back, chose life over dissolution. But I never remembered making that choice, never retained the knowledge of these previous iterations. I was trapped in a cycle, endlessly reaching this 0 point, endlessly deciding to return, endlessly forgetting. The mechanical voice spoke one more time. Mason Garrett. Temporal loop detected. This is iteration 847. Previous iterations resulted in return to baseline reality with memory suppression. Recommend same course of action to maintain stability. 847 times. I'd been here 847 times, made this choice 847 times and never knew it. The highway had been recycling me, using me as some kind of test subject, seeing if my decision would ever change. I keyed my mic and spoke, my voice surprisingly steady. I'm going back, same as always. But this time I want to remember. No memory suppression. I need to know what I've been through. The static surged, and I heard what might have been surprise or concern in the voices that emerged. Memory retention not recommended. Knowledge of iterations causes psychological instability. Subject, Garrett should maintain standard reset protocol. "I don't care," I said. "I want to remember. I want to know what I've been choosing all these other times." There was a long pause, filled with that underlying pulse, that heartbeat engine sound. Then the original voice came back, sounding almost sad. "If you retain memories, Mason, you'll know too much. You'll understand what the highway really is, what we all are. And that knowledge changes everything. Most drivers can't handle it. They make different choices next time, choices that lead to complications." I thought about that for a moment, about whether I really wanted to know, whether ignorance might actually be preferable. But I was tired of being manipulated, tired of being reset and recycled without my knowledge. I wanted truth, even if it was uncomfortable. "Let me remember," I said again. "Whatever the consequences, I'll deal with them." The world lurched. Time started moving forward again, but wrong, like a film played at variable speeds. The landscape outside my windows aged rapidly, gravel becoming asphalt, wilderness becoming developed land, my truck updating through decades of technological advancement in seconds, and my mind filled with memories, 847 iterations of this same moment, this same choice, all flooding back simultaneously. I saw myself making this decision over and over, saw the different ways I'd phrased my choice, the different emotions I'd felt each time. Sometimes I was certain. Sometimes I hesitated. Sometimes I asked questions that received no answers. But always, I chose to go back. And I understood now what that meant. The highway wasn't just roads. It was a network of consciousness, built from the minds of every driver who'd ever traveled it, fed by every thought and fear and hope experienced along its length. And drivers like me, who could perceive this underlying reality, we were nodes in the network. Connection points between the physical roads and the consciousness that inhabited them. We chose, over and over, to return to consensus reality. And each time we did, we strengthened the boundary between normal space and highway space. We were anchors, preventing the highway consciousness from expanding too far, from consuming too much of normal reality. And the iterations, the resets, the memory suppressions, they were all part of maintaining that balance. If we remembered too much, understood too clearly what we were doing, we might make different choices. Might decide to stay in the highway consciousness, or might refuse to return at all, disrupting the delicate equilibrium. I was back in my truck on Highway 1, in my own time, in consensus reality. But I remembered all of it now, every iteration, every choice, every warning I'd received and given. And I understood that I would be here again, making this choice again. Probably 847 more times at least. The highway wouldn't let me go, couldn't let me go, because I was too valuable as an anchor point. The CB crackled with static, and a voice I recognized as my own said, "Welcome back, Mason. Iteration 848. You chose memory retention this time. How do you feel?" I stared at the radio, understanding now what the original voice had been all along. It was me, from previous iterations, recordings of my own transmissions played back to guide my current self. The highway had been using my own voice to influence my decisions, creating the illusion of external guidance when really I was just listening to echoes of myself. "I feel trapped," I said aloud. "I feel like I've been driving the same route forever, and I'll be driving it forever more." My own voice responded, "That's accurate, but also incomplete. You're not just trapped, you're necessary. Without drivers like us, the highway would expand uncontrollably, consume more and more of reality. We're the boundary keepers, the ones who choose the physical world over the consciousness that wants to swallow it. And yes, will make this choice forever, but that's what makes it meaningful. I drove the rest of the way to Tuktoyaktuk in silence, my mind processing everything I now remembered, everything I now understood. When I delivered my load and started back south, the transmission started again. Different voices, other drivers experiencing their own iterations, their own cycles of choice and return. I recognized some of them now, understood that I'd heard them before in previous loops, that we were all part of the same system. My logbook showed the current date as the date I'd started this run. No temporal displacement, no missing hours. But I knew now that time had become irrelevant for me. I existed in a state of perpetual present, always making the choice to return, always forgetting until the moment came to remember. And I would keep driving, keep making runs through the territories, keep serving as an anchor between realities. The last entry in my logbook, dated years in the future, read, "Completed iteration 2000, still here, still driving, still choosing the highway over the highway. Recommend maintaining this pattern indefinitely. Signed, Mason Garrett, mile marker 0.